Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Before we begin, take a moment to settle yourself. Quiet your mind, let the day fall away, and lean into this slow kind of storytelling. Whether you're here because you can't sleep, or because you want a calm companion while you're working, cooking, this channel is made for you. If you enjoy this kind of long-form, soft science, the kind that doesn't shout answers, but gently shares what we know so far, then consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps this kind of educational storytelling reach others who might need a calm way to learn, and maybe even conquer the world with a little more knowledge and a little less noise. I'd love for you to share in the comments how you use this channel. Do you listen before bed, while working, or maybe during your commute? Or tell me where in the world you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see the places this quiet community reaches. And if you happen to drift off in the middle of the story, don't worry. I've left timestamps in the description so you can find your place the next day. Because this whole story from start to finish is worth hearing. This is not a channel for wild speculation or dramatic claims. It's a space for science that stays soft and humble, told slowly, with the honesty that we don't always have the answers, but we do our best. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's step back 100,000 years to a time when 6 kinds of humans walked the earth. 100,000 years ago. It sounds like a long time, and it is. But compared to the history of the earth, it is a blink. If you spread the 4.5 billion years of Earth's history across a single calendar year, then dinosaurs vanish on Christmas Day, agriculture is invented on New Year's Eve just before midnight, and everything we're going to talk about in this episode, our own kind of humans and the strange world they lived in, would be happening just minutes before the clock strikes 12. We often forget how shallow human time really is in the scale of geological time. To say 100,000 years ago is to point to a sliver so fine you can barely see it on the cosmic timeline, and yet inside that sliver, entire ice sheets advanced, seas retreated, whole animal species appeared and vanished, and multiple kinds of humans were alive at once. When we ask what life was like 100,000 years ago, we have to pause and admit that this phrase hides a great deal of complexity. It was not one frozen photograph of a single day. It was an age that stretched across thousands of generations. Your own lifetime is about 80 years if you're lucky. Multiply that by more than 1,000, and you begin to sense the depth of this slice of time. People were being born, growing up and dying again and again across centuries. Their landscapes shifted around them in ways that could be sudden or slow. Their climate was rarely stable. A drought that lasted a decade would change everything for them, while to us it is only a line on a graph. So why choose 100,000 years ago as our entry point? Because it sits right in the middle of something scientists call the last glacial period. That period began roughly 115,000 years ago, and ended about 11,700 years ago, when the Holocene, our current epoch, began. In other words, when you step back 100,000 years, you're looking at a planet still caught in the rhythms of an ice age. Not an endless frozen wasteland, but a world where ice was a permanent fact of geography, and where climate was unstable, swinging between cold and less cold, dry and wetter, with enormous consequences for life. To make sense of this world, we first have to grasp how ice ages work. An ice age is not one long deep freeze. It is a cycle. There are glacial periods when ice sheets expand, and interglacial periods when they retreat. Right now, in fact, we're still technically in the Quaternary Ice Age, which began 2.5 million years ago, because permanent ice still exists at the poles. We just happen to be living in one of the warmer interglacial phases. But 100,000 years ago, humanity lived in one of the colder ones. Ice sheets spread across North America, across northern Europe, and across high plateaus. As ice grew, sea levels dropped, exposing land bridges that are today hidden beneath the sea. Rivers shifted, deserts expanded, and forests shrank. This constant reshaping of geography was the stage on which humans lived their fragile lives. It is difficult to imagine what that world felt like without slipping into exaggeration. It was not a Hollywood apocalypse. It was not constant disaster. It was simply unstable. Seasons were harsher. A fertile valley could become barren in a generation. A water source could vanish, and whole groups would have to move. These were not people who built permanent cities or vast storage systems. They had to adapt to change as it happened, with whatever tools and knowledge they carried in their heads and hands. From a geological perspective, 100,000 years ago is also important because it captures a crossroads. On one hand, the Earth's climate had already been locked into ice age cycles for well over 1 million years. On the other, the species we call Homo sapiens had been around for perhaps 200,000 years already, and were just beginning to step outside their African birthplace. This means that 100,000 years ago is one of the few moments when we can clearly see both the natural forces shaping the planet and the human forces beginning to answer back. The dialogue between climate and culture, between ice sheets and fire pits, was fully underway. When we look at maps of that time, they are both familiar and alien. The continents are where they are now, but the coastlines are different. With so much water locked in ice, sea levels were dozens of meters lower. You could have walked across what is now the floor of the English Channel. Large parts of Southeast Asia were one continuous landmass rather than scattered islands. Australia and New Guinea were joined. In contrast, areas we know today as fertile farmland, like much of northern Europe, were under ice. What seems permanent to us, the line between land and sea, between fertile ground and desert, was shifting beneath their feet. And this is why 100,000 years ago is so compelling. It was a world balanced between the familiar and the strange. The animals were, in some cases, recognizable. There were mammoths and rhinoceroses, lions and hyenas, antelope and elephants. But their shapes were different, often bigger, often better armoured for the cold. The landscapes were recognizable too. Forests, grasslands, rivers, deserts. But the scale of their shifts was nothing like what most of us have experienced in our own lives. In a single human lifetime, the edges of the Sahara could turn from green to sand. In a few generations, a valley that once echoed with herds could fall silent. We also choose this point in time because it forces us to confront something we often forget. We were not alone. We like to think of humanity as inevitable, as if we were destined to be the only ones. But 100,000 years ago, the world was full of hominins, multiple branches of our broader family alive together. It is tempting to list them, to say their names now, but for the moment it is enough to hold on to the fact that our species was just one among several. We were not exceptional, not yet. We were part of a crowded stage, and our future was uncertain. When scientists study this period, they do not find clear answers, but traces. A footprint hardened in desert sand, a layer of ash in a cave, a tooth in a riverbed, each one a fragile window into a moment so long gone that we cannot imagine it clearly. And so, when we say, life 100,000 years ago, we're not reconstructing it with certainty. We're making our best model from fragments. We have to hold our conclusions lightly, because they may change when the next jawbone or the next stone tool is unearthed. That is the humility of this kind of science. We do not always know. We are guessing, carefully, with evidence. What we do know is that this world was harsh, but not hopeless. People lived, they survived, they adapted. They found ways to make tools sharper, to coax fire to burn hotter, to follow herds across uncertain landscapes. Their lives were full of risks, but also full of ordinary days, waking, walking, gathering, sleeping. It is easy to paint the past as exotic, but to them it was just life. They did not know they were prehistoric. They were simply human in their own time. There is also a deeper reason why this slice of time matters to us today. It is the threshold of our own story. If you go back much further, the species we call human were still emerging, still different enough from us that we might hesitate to recognize them as kin. If you go forward to 50,000 years ago, the picture becomes clearer. Modern humans expanding, painting caves, burying their dead. But 100,000 years ago is the in-between. It is the point where the world was set with possibilities, where the dice were being rolled. Would our species endure? Would another branch take over? We only know the answer because we are here. They did not. As far as the Earth was concerned, of course, none of this mattered. The ice advanced and retreated. Rivers carved new paths. Animals migrated. The planet did what it has always done. It changed. Humans were just one of the many species scrambling to keep up. When you think about it that way, it is humbling. We like to imagine ourselves as the main characters, but in truth we were minor players then, learning to adapt to forces far larger than ourselves. And that brings us back to the haunting question. If you were standing there 100,000 years ago, and you looked around, what would you have seen? You would have seen people, yes, but not just people like you. You would have seen a landscape both familiar and alien. You would have felt a climate far more unstable than what most of us grew up with. You would not know who would survive. You might not even care. To you, it would just be life. Another morning. Another fire to keep burning. That is the power of this time window. It reminds us how fragile our existence really is. We are the last survivors of a family that once filled the world. 100,000 years ago, we were just one among many, walking a planet of shifting ice, changing seas, and uncertain futures. Today we look back and wonder, why us? Why did we last, when so many others did not? That is the question we will carry forward as we explore this world step by step through the evidence left behind. What kind of planet were humans living on 100,000 years ago, when ice sheets ruled? To answer that, we have to let go of the Earth we know today. The familiar maps we hang on classroom walls are snapshots of a warm interglacial, like the one we live in now. But the true background of the last 2.5 million years has not been warmth. It has been cold. The Earth we know best, the world with cities on coastlines, rivers flowing in reliable courses, and deserts and forests sitting where we expect them. This is actually a rare condition, a brief thaw in a long ice age. The ice age that still holds us, the Quaternary, began around 2,600,000 years ago. That is when permanent ice caps gripped the poles. Since then, the rhythm of the planet has been one of advance and retreat. Glacials and interglacials. Ice swelling outward, then pulling back, over and over. Our species has existed entirely inside this cold rhythm. We have never known a truly ice-free planet. To imagine the lives of people 100,000 years ago is to imagine them standing at a moment when that rhythm tilted toward cold once again. Around 115,000 years ago, the last interglacial came to an end. The warmth that had briefly allowed forests to stretch farther north, that had opened green corridors across regions now arid, gave way to another pulse of cold. Ice sheets began to thicken in the high latitudes. Glaciers grew down valleys, spreading slowly but relentlessly. The world was tilting into what we now call the last glacial period, and it would not come to an end for more than 100,000 years. The humans alive then, scattered in small groups across Africa and parts of Eurasia, had no way of knowing they had entered a cycle that would shape every aspect of their lives. To them, it was simply the world. When you picture an ice sheet, it is tempting to imagine a static wall of white. But the reality is far more dynamic. Ice is heavy, fluid, and restless. Over thousands of years it creeps forward, grinding rock beneath it, carving valleys, pushing debris into ridges. At the peak of glacial expansions, much of North America, Northern Europe, and Siberia would be uninhabitable. But 100,000 years ago, the world was not yet locked in its maximum freeze. This was the beginning. Ice sheets had begun their expansion, reshaping rivers and coastlines, but they were still far from the colossal reach they would have 20 or 30,000 years later. That means the world of 100,000 years ago was cold, but it was not uniformly so. It was a patchwork of advancing glaciers, shifting deserts, and landscapes in flux. One of the clearest markers of these changes is sea level. When water is locked up in ice, the oceans fall. During the height of the last glacial maximum, sea levels dropped by over 100 metres compared to today. Vast areas of continental shelf became dry land. Bridges of earth connected continents that are now separated by seas. But 100,000 years ago, the drop was smaller, because the ice had only begun to gather. The Red Sea, for example, may have been narrower than today, but not yet the shallow land bridge it would become. The Bering Strait between Asia and North America was still covered in water, waiting tens of thousands of years before the seas pulled back enough to expose the land route into the Americas. Geography was in motion, and humans were caught between these opening and closing pathways. The Sahara is another example. We're used to thinking of it as eternal desert, but that is an illusion. The Sahara has swung back and forth many times between arid sand and green savanna. During wetter periods, often linked to warmer interglacials, monsoons fed rivers and lakes across what is now barren. But 100,000 years ago, as ice spread northward, the climate engine shifted. The Sahara dried. What had been a corridor of grass and water became once again a barrier of dust and heat. For humans in Africa, this mattered profoundly. It meant the pathways out of Africa, through North Africa and into the Levant, were no longer green and inviting. They were closing. It meant groups became isolated, separated by deserts, too harsh to cross without help. Climate was not just a backdrop, it was a gatekeeper. If we moved north into Europe, the picture was just as unstable. Glaciers pressed south, covering Scandinavia, parts of the British Isles, and the higher peaks of the Alps. Between the ice sheets and the southern forests stretched a belt of steppe and tundra, cold, dry, dominated by grasses and shrubs. These were not lush lands, but they could support herds of grazing animals, and that meant they could also support the hunters who followed them. Rivers flowing out of the ice sheets carried meltwater south, carving valleys that shifted with each advance and retreat of ice. The landscape was constantly being reworked, scraped, flooded, dried. Nothing was fixed. In Asia, similar patterns played out. Central Asia oscillated between steppe and desert. The Himalayas intercepted monsoons, sending rainfall patterns north or south, depending on the strength of the winds. Siberia grew harsher as ice advanced, pushing habitable zones southward. And in East Asia, the coastline stretched farther out, exposing land that is now underwater. The geography of the continents was different enough that the world map of 100,000 years ago would look familiar at first glance, but uncanny the longer you studied it. Rivers in different courses, coasts pulled outward, deserts and grasslands occupying spaces we no longer expect. What drove these shifts? The answer lies in the slow dance of the Earth around the Sun. Our orbit is not a perfect circle. It wobbles, tilts, and stretches on cycles that last tens of thousands of years. These are called Milankovitch cycles, and they change how much sunlight different parts of the Earth receive. When the tilt and orbit line up in certain ways, summers in the northern hemisphere are cooler, meaning winter snow does not fully melt, and ice accumulates year after year. Over centuries, glaciers grow. Once ice sheets reach a certain size, they amplify their own presence, reflecting more sunlight back into space, cooling the planet further and pulling the climate deeper into glaciation. 100,000 years ago, this process was underway. The orbital cycles had shifted, the ice was responding, and the world was tipping back into cold. We know this not from written records, but from the Earth itself. Ice cores drilled in Greenland and Antarctica carry tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped as snow was compressed into ice. By analysing those bubbles, scientists can reconstruct the composition of the atmosphere tens and even hundreds of thousands of years ago. They show us how carbon dioxide levels dropped as ice expanded, how temperatures fell in sync with orbital cycles. Sediment cores from the ocean floor tell a similar story, with layers of microscopic shells recording changes in ocean temperatures and currents. Together, these records build a picture of a planet entering another long glacial phase. For the humans alive then, these processes were invisible. They did not know about orbital cycles or carbon dioxide. They knew only that the rains failed more often, that rivers shifted, that winters bit harder, that familiar lands turned barren. Climate change was not an abstract graph for them. It was the daily reality of survival. When the Sahara dried, it meant fewer animals to hunt, fewer plants to gather, longer walks to water. When glaciers advanced, it meant valleys they once used were cut off, rivers they once crossed were choked with ice. Climate was the invisible hand shaping their movements, forcing them into new territories, isolating them into pockets, or driving them together in corridors of survival. It is tempting to see this as pure hardship, but instability also created opportunity. Lower sea levels exposed new coastal plains, rich with food. Expanding grasslands opened routes for following herds. Droughts may have driven humans to experiment with new foods, new strategies. Climate was a harsh teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. The humans who endured 100,000 years ago were not simply victims of cold and drought. They were learning, adapting, responding to the world's restlessness. When we step back and consider the entire planet at this moment, we see a mosaic. At high latitudes, ice was building. In the tropics, deserts like the Sahara were expanding. In between, belts of grassland and steppe stretched across continents. Sea levels were lower but not yet at their lowest. Pathways for migration opened and closed like the breath of the earth. It was not one static world, but a world in motion. And this raises a haunting question. If you could look down on the earth from space 100,000 years ago, what would you see? You would see ice creeping south, deserts spreading, coastlines stretching. You would see a planet rearranging itself, slowly but relentlessly. And somewhere in that shifting mosaic, you would see small bands of humans, fragile, scattered, adapting as best they could. They did not know the cycles driving the ice. They did not know the future extent of the glaciers. They only knew the consequences: hunger, thirst, movement, survival. In that sense, the cold frame of the world was not just a backdrop. It was the canvas on which human history was painted. Every migration, every separation, every survival strategy was shaped by the rhythms of this glacial age. When we ask what life was like 100,000 years ago, we cannot separate humans from climate. They were inseparable. The ice shaped the people, and the people in time would find ways to shape their world back. But at that moment, 100,000 years ago, the balance was one-sided. The ice ruled, the climate shifted, and humanity followed. How many kinds of humans existed 100,000 years ago, and what did they look like? We often think of humanity as singular, as if the story was always about us, Homo sapiens, marching steadily toward the present. But 100,000 years ago, the Earth was crowded. At least 6 kinds of humans, perhaps more, were alive at the same time. Some were our close cousins, almost indistinguishable from us at a glance. Others were so different that meeting them would have been like encountering a creature from myth. For most of them, we do not have complete skeletons, only fragments, but those fragments whisper enough for us to know that our family tree was once tangled and branching, not the straight line of triumph we sometimes imagine. The first of these humans is, of course, our own kind. By 100,000 years ago, anatomically modern Homo sapiens had been around for more than 100,000 years already, perhaps even 200,000. Fossils in Morocco at Jebel Irhoud, dating back 300,000 years, suggest an even earlier origin. These people would have looked very much like us. Their skulls were rounded, their faces less protruding than earlier species, and their bodies gracile compared to the stocky forms of their cousins. But their distribution was still limited. Most lived in Africa, with some groups extending into the Levant. They were not yet the global species we would later become. At this point, we were just one branch among many. The second kind were the Neanderthals. They had emerged from earlier hominin populations in Europe and Western Asia, perhaps derived from Homo heidelbergensis, sometime after 400,000 years ago. By 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals were spread widely across Europe, into the Middle East, and stretching eastward towards Central Asia. They were not the brutish caricatures once drawn in textbooks. They were humans, but built differently. Their skulls were elongated, with heavy brow ridges, their bodies short and powerful, adapted to conserve heat in colder climates. If you met one in the woods dressed in modern clothes, you would recognize them as human instantly, though with a face subtly unfamiliar. They were not an evolutionary dead end waiting to vanish. They had already thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to Ice Age Europe with resilience. Third are the Denisovans, who remain the most enigmatic of all. For them, we do not have complete skeletons, not even close. Their existence is known mostly from a handful of bones and crucially from ancient DNA. The first clear evidence came from Denisova Cave in Siberia, where a finger bone and a few teeth were found. Later discoveries added a mandible from Tibet. From these scraps and from the genetic signatures they left in modern human populations in parts of Asia and Oceania, we know that Denisovans were a distinct human lineage, close relatives of Neanderthals but not identical. They must have occupied a vast range across Asia, from the cold mountains to the tropics, but their exact appearance is still uncertain. Reconstructions are speculative. Were they robust like Neanderthals, or more gracile, Closer to us? We cannot yet say. They remind us of how incomplete the fossil record is, how much of our own family remains hidden. Fourth are the remnants of Homo erectus. This species had first appeared nearly 2 million years earlier, and for most of that span it had been the great pioneer, the first human to leave Africa and spread across Asia. By 100,000 years ago, however, Homo erectus was a shadow of its former self. Most populations had vanished, replaced or absorbed by newer lineages. Yet on the island of Java, in Indonesia, an isolated group of Erectus still held on. Fossils at Ngandong suggest they survived until at least 108,000 years ago, perhaps even later. These were relics of a deeper past, carrying forward traits that had once defined humanity, but were now fading. Their skulls were lower and more angular than ours, their bodies strong but less refined. Meeting them would have been like meeting an ancestor pulled forward through time. Fifth is Homo floresiensis, perhaps the most astonishing of all. Found on the Indonesian island of Flores, this species was tiny, barely over a metre tall as adults. They have been nicknamed hobbits, though that makes them sound like fantasy. They were real, living humans, with small brains but evidence of tool use and fire. Their small size is thought to be the result of island dwarfism, the evolutionary tendency for large animals isolated on islands to become smaller over generations when resources are limited. They lived in landscapes where pygmy elephants roamed and giant lizards hunted. Their exact origins are debated. They may have descended from Homo erectus, shrinking in isolation, or from an even earlier dispersal out of Africa. What matters for our story is that 100,000 years ago, they were alive, part of the human family, but radically different from us. And the sixth is Homo luzonensis, discovered only recently in a cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Their remains, teeth, finger bones, and a fragment of a femur, are fragmentary, but distinct enough to identify them as a separate lineage. They too were small, under 1.5 meters tall. Like the hobbits of Flores, they show signs of island dwarfism. Their age is around 60 to 67,000 years ago, but given the uncertainties of dating, it is likely their ancestors were present 100,000 years ago. Luzon has been an island for millions of years, which means these humans, or their ancestors, somehow crossed the sea to reach it. We do not know how. Their presence forces us to imagine seafaring humans far earlier than once believed. These six, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, and Homo luzonensis, form the cast of characters for the world 100,000 years ago. But even this list may be incomplete. New discoveries continue to surprise us. The Nesha Ramla fossils from Israel, dated to around 120 to 140,000 years ago, hint at a population distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, possibly representing a transitional group. Other fragmentary finds in China and Southeast Asia suggest there may have been additional lineages, either poorly understood or awaiting discovery. The fossil record is sparse, and many regions have not yet been fully explored. It is very possible that other humans lived alongside these six, their bones still buried, their names unknown. So what did it mean to live in such a world? Imagine standing on a hill 100,000 years ago and looking out. The people in your group are not alone on the continent. Over the horizon, in a forest, in a valley, on an island, other humans exist. They are close enough to resemble you, close enough that interbreeding was possible, but distinct enough that you would recognize them as different. This was not a world of one humanity, but of many, a mosaic of human forms spread across landscapes shaped by ice and sea. It is important to resist the temptation to rank them. We often slip into thinking of Homo sapiens as superior, destined to survive, and the others as doomed. But at 100,000 years ago, that was not obvious. Neanderthals had already thrived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus had endured longer than any other human species before or since. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis had adapted to their islands in ways we still struggle to understand. The Denisovans left their mark in our own DNA, which means they too were successful, at least for a time. We cannot say that our survival was inevitable. It was just one outcome among many. What is striking is the diversity itself. Evolution does not produce uniformity. It experiments. In different regions, under different pressures, humans adapted in different ways. Bigger bodies for cold, smaller bodies for islands, different faces, different jaws, different skull shapes. Yet all of them were recognisably human. They made tools, they controlled fire, they lived in groups. The boundaries between species are blurrier than our categories suggest. Modern genetics shows us that these groups interbred, swapping genes, blurring distinctions. The picture is not one of separate boxes, but of overlapping circles, and this leads us to a haunting thought. If you could walk among them, would you know which was your ancestor? If you met a Neanderthal, would you recognise them as family? If you saw a Hobbit on Flores, would you see kinship or difference? 100,000 years ago, the answer was not clear. The humans alive then did not know they were in competition for the future. They were just surviving, each in their own way, on a restless planet. When we tell this story, it is easy to focus only on ourselves, but to do so is to miss the richness of our shared past. We were not alone. We were one thread in a tapestry of humanity. Most of those threads have been cut, leaving us as the last survivor, but remembering them matters, because it reminds us of how contingent our existence really is. We are not the inevitable pinnacle. We are the lucky branch that did not break. 100,000 years ago, 6 kinds of humans lived on Earth, each with their own bodies, their own adaptations, their own histories. They shared the planet, sometimes overlapping, sometimes isolated, each carrying forward the story of what it means to be human in their own way. Today, only one remains. The question that shadows us is, why? Who were the last apes to rival us in size? The question sounds like something from folklore, as if there had once been giants who walked among us and then faded into legend. Yet there really were such creatures, and their bones, scattered across caves in southern China and Southeast Asia, tell of an ape so immense that even our strongest ancestors would have looked small beside it. This was Gigantopithecus, the great ape that survived until around 100,000 years ago, a ghost from a deeper past that lingered into the same window of time as early humans. Gigantopithecus is known almost entirely from teeth and jaw fragments. Unlike Homo sapiens or Neanderthals, we do not have full skeletons. We cannot mount one in a museum and point to it as we can with a mammoth or a dinosaur. What we have are hundreds of teeth, thick and massive, sometimes weighing 3 times as much as a human molar, and a few pieces of mandible so wide they dwarf the jawbones of any living ape. From these fragments, scientists have tried to reconstruct what the creature must have been like. The consensus is that Gigantopithecus was enormous, perhaps standing 3 meters tall when upright and weighing 500 kilograms or more. It was the largest ape to ever live. Its closest living relatives are the orangutans, and genetic studies confirm this. Like them, it probably moved slowly with powerful arms, adapted to climbing or bracing itself against trees. But at its size, it cannot have been a nimble forest acrobat. It was almost certainly bound to the ground, a terrestrial giant that still depended on the forest for food and shelter. This dependency would be its undoing. Diet studies on Gigantopithecus teeth, using isotopic analysis and microscopic wear patterns, revealed that it ate primarily fruits, leaves, and stems. In other words, it was a specialist herbivore, relying on the rich forests of Southeast Asia to sustain its bulk. In warm, wet periods, when forests expanded, the giant apes could thrive. But as climates cooled during the Pleistocene, forests receded, replaced by grasslands and open savannas. For more adaptable animals, this was survivable. But for Gigantopithecus, the shrinking of forests was catastrophic. Its enormous body demanded an enormous supply of fruit and vegetation. When those resources diminished, starvation followed. The timing of their extinction is still debated. Most evidence suggests they disappeared roughly 100,000 years ago, but some argue it could have been earlier. Either way, they overlapped with early humans in Asia. Fossil sites in southern China, such as those in Guangxi province, preserve Gigantopithecus teeth in the same caves where Homo erectus remains have been found. This means that at least in some regions, our ancestors and these giant apes shared the landscape. We cannot know if they ever encountered one another, but the possibility lingers. Imagine a band of Erectus moving through a subtropical forest and catching sight of a towering ape pulling down branches to feed. it would have been a moment of awe and perhaps fear. Despite their size, there is no evidence that Gigantopithecus was hunted by humans. The teeth show no cut marks, no signs of deliberate modification, and given their power, hunting them would not have been easy. More likely the relationship was one of avoidance. Humans were already skilled opportunists targeting prey they could reliably kill. Gigantopithecus would have been dangerous, and with forests providing cover, the giant apes may have been rarely seen. But their presence added another layer of complexity to the ecosystems of the time. One question that often arises is whether Gigantopithecus inspired later myths. In Asia, tales of wild, hairy giants, the Yeti, the Yeren, the Orang Pendek, have circulated for centuries. It is tempting to link these stories to memories of encounters with giant apes. But there is no scientific evidence that Gigantopithecus survived into human memory. By the time Homo sapiens expanded widely into Asia, the giants were gone. Still, the idea of humans carrying echoes of these ancient apes in oral traditions cannot be dismissed outright. It remains speculation, but it reminds us of how easily paleontology bleeds into imagination. The real tragedy of Gigantopithecus lies in its specialization. Evolution favors adaptability, and the giants were anything but adaptable. Their massive size, while impressive, made them vulnerable to even small environmental changes. When fruit supplies dwindled, they could not simply switch to grazing like elephants or antelope. Their digestive systems were tuned to forest foods. Even though they overlapped in time with resilient species like Homo erectus, Gigantopithecus did not make the leap into the shifting habitats of the late Pleistocene. In this sense, they were evolutionary specialists caught in a world that no longer supported their niche. What is fascinating is how little of them we truly know. For decades, Gigantopithecus was almost a paleontological rumour, a creature inferred from teeth sold in traditional Chinese medicine shops. Locals called the fossils dragon bones, ground into powder as remedies. It was in the 1930s that paleontologist Gustav von Königswald first recognised the teeth as belonging to an unknown giant ape. Since then, hundreds more teeth have been found, but still only fragments. Without full skeletons, we must rely on comparisons with orangutans to estimate posture, locomotion, and appearance. Was Gigantopithecus a knuckle walker like gorillas, or did it move upright in short bursts? Did it build nests in trees like chimpanzees? These are questions we cannot yet answer. Even so, the little we know forces us to expand our vision of the human past. 100,000 years ago was not only a time of multiple human species, but also a time when our extended family included apes of extraordinary scale. The human story is not separate from theirs. Our ancestors lived in ecosystems shaped partly by the presence of these giants, even if indirectly. The disappearance of Gigantopithecus is a reminder of how fragile even the most imposing creatures can be when climates shift. Size alone does not guarantee survival. Could Gigantopithecus have survived longer in refuges of dense forest? The idea is tantalizing. Vast areas of Southeast Asia remain unexplored paleontologically, and dense jungles are poor at preserving fossils. It is possible, though unlikely, that pockets of these apes endured later than the evidence currently shows. If so, they would have been among the last true giants outside of Africa's elephants and Asia's rhinos. But as far as current science can tell, they were gone by 100,000 years ago, leaving behind only their teeth, scattered in caves like clues to a forgotten chapter. In this way, Gigantopithecus occupies a strange position in our imagination. On the one hand, it is firmly scientific, a species identified by fossils tied by genetics to orangutans, explained through diet and climate. On the other hand, it is ghostly, known only in fragments, its full body never seen. It is both real and elusive, factual and mysterious. For a creature that may have stood 3 meters tall, it is astonishing how little trace it left. And here lies the haunting question. What would it mean if we had lived in a world not only with other human species, but also with apes that dwarfed us? Would we still think of ourselves as the inevitable masters of the planet, or would we have remembered our place as just one primate among many, humbled by a cousin that made us look small? The ghost of Gigantopithecus lingers as a reminder that the past was stranger, richer, and more crowded than we imagine. The giants are gone, but their absence is itself a kind of presence, a space in our story where we glimpse what might have been. What animals shaped the world before us, and who managed to survive us? If you step into the world of 100,000 years ago, you do not just find humans and their relatives. You find landscapes crowded with creatures so large, so formidable, that our species at that point was hardly the most impressive mammal walking around. The truth is that for most of our history, we were small players in ecosystems dominated by giants. These were the Megafauna, a word that simply means big animals, but in practice describes a global menagerie of creatures that once made the world feel like a very different place. 100,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last glacial period. That meant climates were cooler in some regions, drier in others, and much of the planet was shaped by ice sheets, shifting grasslands, and vast deserts. But wherever you looked, there were animals on a scale difficult to imagine today. In the north, herds of mammoths roamed the tundra, their shaggy coats and long tusks adapted to the cold. To the south, in Africa, bizarre antelopes and towering giraffids grazed alongside rhinos and elephants. In South America, there were ground sloths as large as small trucks, armoured glyptodons that looked like living tanks, and a not-quite hippo, not-quite rhino beast called Toxodon. Australia harboured reptiles like the monstrous crocodile quincana and marsupial lions unlike anything alive today. Across Eurasia, predators such as cave hyenas, cave lions, and saber-toothed cats stalked their prey. To live 100,000 years ago was to live among giants. Take the mammoth. It is one of the most iconic Ice Age creatures, but in reality it was not a single species but a whole group. Around this time, the steppe mammoth had already given rise to the woolly mammoth, which would later thrive during the height of the glacial cold. Mammoths were not just big elephants, they were ecosystem engineers. Their constant grazing, trampling, and tusk sweeping helped maintain open grasslands, shaping the environment around them. A herd of mammoths could tear up shrubs, dig through snow to reach grass, and leave behind trails used by countless other animals. They were movers of landscapes, not just passive occupants, but mammoths were far from alone. In Europe and Asia, the tundra was also home to woolly rhinoceroses, huge bison, and giant deer with antlers spanning nearly 4 meters. Imagine a forest opening where a male giant deer is standing, his antlers so wide that they nearly brush the trees on either side. These creatures were part of everyday life, as ordinary to Ice Age eyes as cattle are to us. For predators, they were a feast. For the world's ecosystems, they were pillars. In South America, the scene was different but no less strange. There, the great Toxodon grazed in herds. To us it would look almost like a cross between a hippo, a rhino, and a capybara. Charles Darwin himself once puzzled over Toxodon fossils, describing the animal as one of the strangest he had ever seen. Alongside them lived the giant ground sloths, slow-moving browsers with claws long enough to rip branches off trees. Some species stood over 4 meters tall when rearing up, and lumbering across the grasslands were glyptodons, relatives of armadillos, but the size of small cars. Their domed shells were thick armour, and some species even had clubbed tails like living ankylosaurs. South America at 100,000 years ago was less a continent of modern wildlife than a showcase of evolutionary experiments. In Africa, the cradle of humankind, megafauna still abounded. Today, Africa is the last continent where large animals remain relatively common, but even so it has lost much since the Pleistocene. Back then, it hosted not only elephants and rhinos, but also the massive giraffid known as Civatherium. This animal combined the height of a giraffe with a heavy moose-like body and strange ossicones on its head, giving it a somewhat prehistoric appearance. Beside them lived hippos, zebras, antelope and predators such as lions, leopards and hyenas. But all of these were larger and more diverse than their modern counterparts. Africa was not yet thinned by extinctions. It was a continent of abundance. Australia too was once home to its own set of giants. Among the most fearsome was Quincana, a land-dwelling crocodile that could grow over 6 meters long. Unlike today's crocodiles, which wait in rivers and lakes, Quincana was a predator of the dry land, with long legs built for running. Imagine walking across a savanna and realising that a giant crocodile could sprint after you. That was the world Australian megafauna inhabited. Alongside it were marsupial lions, the largest carnivorous marsupials ever known, with retractable claws and crushing jaws. Giant kangaroos, some twice the size of those today, browsed the grasslands. And enormous flightless birds, heavier than ostriches, patrolled the open plains. Eurasia, meanwhile, was a predator's kingdom. Alongside mammoths and bison lived the cave lion, larger than today's lions and perhaps the most formidable predator in Europe. Cave hyenas formed large packs, outnumbering and overpowering many competitors. Saber-toothed cats, though in decline, still haunted parts of the world, their long canines adapted for taking down large prey. To imagine Ice Age Europe is to imagine a continent far wilder than we usually picture, a place where humans were just one of many medium-sized carnivores trying not to end up as food. What made this megafauna so successful? In part, it was the Ice Age itself. Large animals are more efficient at retaining heat, and many of these species evolved traits perfectly suited to fluctuating climates. Mammoths had insulating underfur. Cave hyenas thrived in open grasslands. In Africa, diversity gave resilience, allowing ecosystems to absorb droughts and wet phases alike. But there was also a sense in which the world simply had more space. Vast, uninterrupted habitats stretched across continents. Animals could migrate long distances, following the rhythms of climate and vegetation. Today's fragmented world, full of fences, roads, and cities, cannot sustain creatures of this size in the same way. 100,000 years ago, it still could. From the perspective of humans alive at the time, these creatures were the background of existence. They were not megafauna in any special sense. They were simply the animals that lived around you. And yet they shaped human possibilities. A world of giant herbivores and predators constrained where humans could settle, when they could move, and what risks they had to take. Though we are not discussing hunting yet, it is important to remember that the very presence of such creatures influenced survival. To cross a valley might mean encountering mammoths. To linger near a cave might mean stumbling into hyenas. Humans were not at the top of the food chain. They were among the watched, not only the watchers. And these giants were themselves shaped by pressures beyond our ancestors. Climate shifts pushed their ranges back and forth. Sea levels rising and falling opened or closed migration routes. Grasslands expanded and contracted. In this way, the megafauna were both dominant and vulnerable, large but subject to forces even they could not resist. That vulnerability would become more evident later, but already 100,000 years ago, ecosystems were testing their limits. It is easy to forget how recent these animals are. We often think of them as distant, almost mythological. But 100,000 years is a blink in geological time. Many of these species survived until very recently. Mammoths and giant ground sloths into the Holocene, only a few thousand years ago. Their absence is still new. We live in a strangely thinned world compared to the richness our ancestors knew. So the haunting question becomes this. What would it feel like to walk outside and see these giants as ordinary neighbours? To know that beyond the next ridge, there might be a herd of toxodon grazing, or a quincana lurking in the grasses? Would we still think of ourselves as extraordinary, or would we see ourselves as small primates in a vast theatre of larger beings? The megafauna that watched humans 100,000 years ago are gone, but in their absence we glimpse how extraordinary their presence once was. They were not just animals, they were the living architecture of the planet, and they remind us that the world we inherited is only a shadow of what once stood. When did Homo sapiens first step outside Africa? That simple question hides a web of uncertainty. It is tempting to imagine a single grand migration, a day when our species packed its things and walked away forever. But the reality, as far as the evidence shows, is not a single departure, but a series of hesitant steps, advances and retreats, some successful for a while, others erased almost entirely. The record we have is fragmentary, scattered across caves, ancient riverbeds, and even footprints pressed into long-vanished mud. But these fragments tell us that the idea of humans venturing out of Africa happened earlier than many once believed. For much of the 20th century, the dominant view was that Homo sapiens only left Africa about 60,000 years ago. That was the neat, tidy model. It fit well with genetic data and provided a clean origin story. Africa gave birth to us, and then we spread across the world. But as more fossils and sites have been dated, the story has grown less tidy. Some evidence suggests that humans had already stepped beyond Africa more than 100,000 years ago, perhaps even as early as 190,000 years ago. These were not the migrations that populated the globe. They were earlier experiments, first footsteps that show curiosity, adaptability, and perhaps restlessness, but which did not last. One of the clearest signs of these early wanderings comes from the Levant, the region that today includes Israel, Lebanon, and surrounding lands. In the caves of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, human remains have been found that look unmistakably like Homo sapiens. The fossils from 𝐓𝐈𝐿 are dated to around 120,000 years ago, and those from 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 to around 100,000 years ago. These are people who had already crossed from Africa into the Middle East, establishing themselves in a new environment. They lived in a landscape that would have included forests, open grasslands, and abundant game. Their presence shows that the first exit had already happened well before the more famous migration 60,000 years ago. But then the trail goes cold. The 𝐓𝐈𝐿 and 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 people did not give rise to later populations in the Levant or beyond. Their line seems to have ended, leaving no continuous legacy. Why? Climate may have played a role. The Levant at this time was a borderland, affected by shifts in rainfall and vegetation, as ice sheets expanded and contracted. Periods of lush greenery could quickly give way to aridity, pushing humans out or confining them to small refuges. It is possible that these early groups were simply overwhelmed by environmental changes they could not control. Their bones remain, but their descendants vanished. Further east there are hints of other exits. In Saudi Arabia, at a site called Al-Wusta, a single finger bone has been dated to around 85,000 years ago. It belonged to a Homo sapiens individual, living in what is now desert but was then a fertile landscape of lakes and grasslands. This is a remarkable discovery, because it shows that humans were present deep inside Arabia much earlier than expected, and it is not alone. Ancient footprints preserved in the sands of the Nefud Desert date to roughly 120,000 years ago. These prints include humans, elephants, and other animals, all converging at a waterhole that no longer exists. The scene is vivid, a moment when people cross paths with giant beasts in a place that today seems uninhabitable. Arabia, it seems, was not just a corridor, but a lived-in world. Yet again, these early presences appear to have been temporary. Arabia's climate is notoriously unstable. Wet phases, when monsoons reached further north, created green corridors full of lakes and rivers. But when the rains retreated, deserts returned, cutting populations off and driving them back. This cycle may explain why traces of humans appear and disappear in Arabia across time. Our species could survive there in windows of opportunity, but the doors often slammed shut. To the east of Arabia, the story becomes more speculative. There are tools in India that some researchers suggest may be linked to early Homo sapiens around 125,000 years ago. But without clear fossil evidence, it is difficult to say for sure. Stone tools are notoriously ambiguous. They do not carry DNA or clear labels. Still, the possibility lingers that humans reached South Asia long before the main migration, leaving only scattered traces. What is striking about these early movements is how they blur the boundary between Africa and the rest of the world. We often think of continents as distinct, but 100,000 years ago, the boundary between northeast Africa and the Levant was more like a shifting threshold. Sea levels were lower, narrowing the Red Sea and exposing land bridges in places. Green corridors opened and closed. In this sense, leaving Africa was not a single dramatic leap. It was a series of crossings that may have felt no more momentous than walking into a new valley. But from our perspective, they matter enormously. Each footprint, each bone, each fossil pushes back the timeline of our species' curiosity. These early exits remind us that humans were never static. From the moment Homo sapiens appeared, there was movement, exploration, and risk-taking. Even if most of these movements did not succeed in establishing lasting populations, they show a pattern, the urge to step beyond familiar boundaries. And yet, for all that, the haunting truth is that these first footsteps did not carry us very far. The humans at 𝐓𝐈𝐿, at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, at Al-Wusta, they were pioneers, but they were also forgotten branches. Their presence faded, their lines extinguished. If you stood in Arabia 85,000 years ago, and looked at those people walking beside elephants at a waterhole, you might have thought they were the beginning of something unstoppable. But history teaches otherwise. They were beginnings without endings. So when did Homo sapiens first step outside Africa? The honest answer is, earlier than once believed, but in fits and starts, with many false dawns. It was not one migration but several, most of which did not last. What remains are traces, footprints in sand, bones in caves, whispers in the archaeological record. They remind us that human history is not just a story of triumph and expansion, it is also a story of experiments, failures, and disappearances. The haunting question is this: how many times did our species try and fail before finally succeeding? How many groups of people stood at the edge of a desert or a sea, looking outward, only to vanish from the story? We will likely never know all their names or numbers, but their presence lingers in the traces they left behind. Reminders that the path out of Africa was not a straight line, but a maze of possibilities, most of which ended in silence. What were our ancestors actually doing inside Africa between 150,000 and 100,000 years ago? We often focus on the moment they left, on the dramatic crossings into Arabia or Europe, but the deeper story is that the foundations of those journeys were laid at home. Africa in this period was not a monolithic environment nor a single cultural story. It was a vast, varied stage where small groups of Homo sapiens were experimenting with ways of living, testing strategies of survival, and shaping the behaviours that would one day allow them to succeed beyond Africa. To understand why our species eventually endured while others vanished, we have to look at what was happening in those tens of thousands of years when we were still mostly contained within Africa. Archaeologists often use the word Aterian to describe one of the cultural expressions from this time. The term comes from a site in Algeria called Bir el Atta, where distinctive stone tools were first recognised. The hallmark of the Aterian is the so-called tanged point, a stone tool with a stem or tang that could be hafted onto a handle or shaft. These were not casual flakes or crude hand axes, they were carefully prepared pieces that suggest foresight, planning, and a knowledge of materials beyond just the stone itself. To haft a point, you need adhesive, binding, and a handle. That means knowledge of resins or plant gums, of sinew or cord, and of wood that could support repeated use. In other words, a tanged point is more than just a sharp edge. It is a composite technology, a joining together of materials into something greater than its parts. The appearance of these tools across North Africa, dated to between 150,000 and 100,000 years ago, suggests a widespread culture, or at least a shared tradition, stretching from Morocco through Algeria into the Sahara. This is important because it implies communication or movement across wide distances. It also hints at a kind of standardization, a mental template of what a tool should look like and how it should be made. When you find tangent points separated by hundreds of kilometers, yet showing similar form, you are looking at a shared idea, not just individual trial and error. But stone points are only the start of the story. Alongside them, archaeologists find evidence that Aterian peoples were moving materials across long distances. In some sites, stone comes from sources located far away, indicating that people either travelled to collect it or obtained it through exchange. This matters because it shows that groups were not isolated. They were part of broader networks, moving, meeting, and possibly trading. This mobility within Africa created a kind of cultural web, one that allowed ideas and materials to circulate. We also see hints of what could be called an early broad-spectrum economy. That phrase usually refers to the much later transition when humans began to diversify their diets, using not just large game but also smaller animals, fish, and plant resources. In the Aterian, we see early signs of that shift. Evidence from coastal and inland sites suggests that people were not solely relying on big animals, but were also exploiting fish, shellfish, and a variety of plants. This diversification would have been crucial in environments where large prey were unpredictable. By broadening their diet, groups could reduce risk and adapt to changing conditions. It also shows flexibility, the willingness to experiment with new food sources rather than sticking rigidly to one strategy. The Sahara itself played a central role in these experiments. Today we imagine it as a vast dry desert, but in the window between 150,000 and 100,000 years ago, it experienced wetter phases when monsoon rains reached further north. These green Sahara periods transformed the desert into grasslands, lakes, and rivers, supporting herds of animals and making it possible for humans to cross areas that are now uninhabitable. Archaeological sites along ancient lake beds and rivers reveal that people were living deep in what is now the driest heart of the desert. They left behind their tools, hearths, and the bones of the animals they hunted. The Sahara was not a barrier but a corridor, sometimes closed, sometimes open, depending on climate. This constant shifting forced adaptation. Populations could thrive during wet phases but had to retreat or perish when aridity returned. These cycles created pulses of movement, driving groups north toward the Mediterranean, west toward the Atlantic, and east toward the Nile. Each pulse was an experiment in dispersal, testing new environments and routes. Some may have succeeded for a time, others ended in collapse, but collectively they created a pattern of exploration that built the skills and resilience later needed for expansion beyond Africa. What did these people look like, and how did they live day to day? Fossil evidence is sparse, but skeletal remains associated with Aterian contexts, suggest anatomically modern humans, with features similar to ours. They were mobile hunter-gatherers, likely living in small groups that moved seasonally. Their lives were shaped by cycles of rainfall and drought, by the availability of stone and water, and by the constant need to anticipate change. The tools they made, the distances they travelled, and the resources they used all point to people who were not just surviving, but innovating. One of the most striking things about this period is how it challenges the old stereotype that early Homo sapiens were passive or static before the Great Migration. The evidence instead shows active experimentation inside Africa. The Aterian is only one example. In Eastern Africa, other tool traditions were unfolding, with their own regional flavours and adaptations. In Southern Africa, still other innovations were appearing, some of which would later feed into the behaviours associated with fully modern humans. Africa was not one uniform story, but a mosaic of cultures, each testing strategies under different conditions. This mosaic also highlights the fragility of our record. What we know comes from the few sites that have survived erosion, burial, and the accidents of discovery. For every site like Bir el Atta or Al Wusta, there were countless camps and hearths that left no trace. Our ancestors' lives were lived at scales invisible to us. Footsteps on sand, fibres twisted into cord, meals cooked and eaten and gone. The few pieces we recover are enough to suggest the richness, but they are only fragments. That is why it is important to speak with humility. We do not have the whole picture. We have shards of stone and bones that whisper of experiments, but the full song is lost. Still, even fragments can be powerful. When we hold a tanged point, we are looking at a decision made more than 100,000 years ago. Someone chose a stone, prepared it, shaped it, and half-did it, with a goal in mind. That decision reflects not just intelligence, but culture. The transmission of knowledge from one person to another, the persistence of an idea across generations. These are the seeds of behaviours that would later allow Homo sapiens to spread into every continent. So what were our ancestors doing inside Africa between 150,000 and 100,000 years ago? They were experimenting. They were making tools that required composite thinking. They were moving materials across distances, hinting at networks of exchange. They were broadening their diets, testing new food sources. They were navigating a Sahara that shifted between desert and grassland, learning resilience in the face of change. In short, they were building the toolkit, both material and cultural, that would one day carry them beyond Africa. The haunting question is how many of these experiments were lost, how many tool types, food strategies, or networks vanished without leaving a trace. We see only the survivors, the successful traditions that left enough behind to be noticed. But the vast majority of human experiments, like the lives of the people themselves, disappeared. That is the paradox of archaeology. We learn so much, but we also become acutely aware of how much we will never know. And yet, there is comfort in that. It reminds us that our ancestors were like us, restless, curious, never satisfied with one way of doing things. They tried, failed, and tried again. They did not have a master plan, just a series of small experiments in living. And from those experiments, eventually, came the resilience that allowed our species to endure. When did humans start turning Earth into art? It is a question that cannot be answered with a single date or a single discovery, but some of the most compelling evidence comes from a windswept cave on the southern coast of Africa. Known as Blombos Cave, it overlooks the Indian Ocean from a cliff of limestone, its entrance today hidden behind shifting dunes. To stand there is to face a horizon that stretches seemingly without end, but what matters most is not the view outside the cave, but the story of what was happening inside it between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Because in that darkness, our species left behind traces of something new, not just survival, but symbolism. The story begins with ochre. Ochre is simply iron-rich earth, a mineral pigment that can be red, yellow or brown depending on its chemistry. It is found in soils and rocks across the world, and people have been drawn to it for millennia. At Blombos, archaeologists discovered not just pieces of ochre, but evidence that it had been deliberately ground, scraped and mixed. Around 100,000 years ago, someone in that cave prepared what looks very much like a paint kit. The artifacts included abalone shells filled with ground ochre, fragments of quartzite that had been used as grindstones, and traces of bone and fat that may have been mixed with the powder to make a paste. This was not casual colouring. It was a recipe, a process of combining materials into a substance that could be applied to skin, objects, or surfaces. The significance lies not in the pigment itself, but in the act of preparing it. Here we see planning, intention, and perhaps symbolic thinking. To grind ochre into powder and mix it with binding agents requires forethought. To store it in a shell for later use suggests anticipation of future needs, and to apply it, whatever the purpose, implies that colour itself held meaning. Whether it was used for body decoration, for marking objects, or for ritual, we cannot know for certain. But it was more than a practical tool. It was pigment prepared with a purpose. Even more striking are the engraved ochre pieces found at Blombos. One fragment bears a series of cross-hatched lines, deliberately incised, forming a pattern that looks like a simple grid or lattice. It is not a doodle made by accident while scraping pigment. The lines intersect and repeat with intentionality. Another piece shows parallel lines with a central cross-stroke. These marks are not figurative in the way we might think of art today. They do not depict an animal or a human figure. Instead, they are abstract, geometric, symbolic. They suggest that the person who carved them was able to think in terms of pattern and representation, to make a mark that stands for something else, even if we no longer know what that something was. And then there are the beads. In layers dated to around 75,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered small perforated shells, Nasarius kraussianus, that had been deliberately pierced and strung. Some still bore traces of ochre, suggesting they had been coloured before use. These are among the oldest known personal ornaments in the world. A bead is a simple thing, but its implications are profound. To make a bead and wear it is to engage in symbolic display. It says something about identity, about belonging to a group, about marking oneself as different or special. Beads transform the body into a canvas, carrying meaning that can be seen by others. Taken together, the paint kits, the engravings, the beads, the finds at Blombos form one of the earliest packages of evidence for symbolic behaviour in Homo sapiens. They show that by 100,000 years ago, some of our ancestors were already capable of abstract thought, of creating and using symbols. This does not mean that Blombos was the birthplace of art, or that symbolism was invented in a single cave. Other sites in Africa and beyond hint at similar practices. But Blombos provides an unusually clear and concentrated snapshot of these behaviours. The question, of course, is what these symbols meant. Here we run into the limits of archaeology. We can analyse the pigments, measure the beads, and trace the engravings, but the meanings are lost. Were the ochre marks clan symbols, ritual emblems, or simply aesthetic designs? Did the beads mark social status, or were they merely decorations? Was the paint applied to bodies for ceremony, or to objects for storage and transmission? We do not know. And perhaps that is the most humbling lesson. Symbolism is about meaning, but meaning itself does not fossilise. What we can say is that these behaviours reflect a new way of thinking about the world. They suggest that Homo sapiens at this time were not only concerned with the immediate tasks of survival, but also with ideas, identities, and representations. Symbolism implies communication, a way of conveying messages that go beyond the here and now. A cross-hatched engraving does not feed you or protect you directly, but it connects minds. It allows shared meaning to exist outside the body, in marks that can be seen and remembered. Some researchers see Blombos as evidence of the emergence of fully modern human cognition. Others caution that we must be careful not to impose our own categories on the past. Perhaps these behaviours were sporadic, not universal. Perhaps symbolism flickered in and out across different groups, appearing in one place and time, disappearing in another. What we see at Blombos may be one experiment among many, not a sudden revolution. The fact that we find so few such sites may reflect the patchiness of preservation rather than the absence of behaviour. The truth is, we cannot be certain. Still, the resonance of these discoveries is undeniable. When we look at a shell bead or an engraved ochre fragment, we feel a kinship with the person who made it. We recognise that they too lived in a world of meaning, of symbols, of things that stood for other things. In that sense, they were like us. Yet the gap remains. We cannot know what they were thinking, only that they were capable of thinking in this way. It is worth pausing on the location itself. Blombos Cave is perched above the ocean, its interior dark and cool. People lived there in episodes, coming and going, leaving behind hearths, tools, and ornaments. To imagine those lives is to picture small groups gathering around firelight, grinding pigment, piercing shells, marking ochre with lines. Outside, the waves pounded the shore as they still do today. The rhythms of the sea framed their experiments in symbolism, just as the rhythms of climate shaped their survival. Why there, and why then? Perhaps the cave offered stability, a reliable shelter in a changing world. Perhaps coastal resources provided food security, freeing time and energy for experimentation with symbols. Or perhaps it is simply chance that this cave preserved what countless others did not. Archaeology is always at the mercy of accidents of preservation. We find what survives, not necessarily what was most common. What we can say with some confidence is that by 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens in Africa were engaging in symbolic practices that foreshadowed the art, ornamentation, and ritual of later periods. Blombos is part of a broader pattern that includes ochre use at sites like Pinnacle Point and beads, found elsewhere along the African coasts. Together, these discoveries push back the timeline of symbolism far earlier than once thought. No longer can we say that art began in Europe 40,000 years ago. The roots run much deeper, back into Africa, back toward 100,000 years ago. The haunting question is why these behaviours sometimes vanish from the record. After the layers at Blombos, the evidence becomes sparse again for a time. Symbolism appears, flickers, and then seems to recede. Was it lost? Was it abandoned in the face of environmental pressures? Or did it continue elsewhere, unseen by us, in caves and camps that left no trace? The archaeological record is not a steady progression, but a broken rhythm. And in those gaps, our confidence falters. Perhaps that is fitting. Symbolism is not a straight line. It is a cloud of possibilities, some realised, some forgotten. Blombos gives us a glimpse into one such possibility. A world where ochre became paint, shells became beads, and lines became symbols. A world where humans began turning Earth into art. The real question is not whether Blombos was the first, but whether it was unique. How many other caves once held similar experiments? How many beads were lost? How many engravings erased? How many pigments washed away? We cannot know. What we do know is that at least once on the southern coast of Africa, people chose to see more in the world than survival. They chose to make symbols, and that choice still echoes in us today. Did our ancestors invent fishing technology tens of thousands of years before we thought? To even ask the question is to place ourselves on the banks of an African river nearly 90,000 years ago, where the humid forests of Central Africa opened into wetlands and waterways teeming with fish. Here, among the mud, reeds, and slow currents of what is now the Semliki River Valley in the Democratic Republic of Congo, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Carefully shaped bone points, some barbed, some smooth, and all unmistakably designed to pierce and hold living creatures from the water. These are the Katanda harpoons, a set of artifacts that push the origins of complex fishing technology back far earlier than many once believed. The site lies near present-day Katanda, in a landscape that has long shifted with the flow of rivers and the growth of forests. Excavations revealed bone tools in layers securely dated to about 90,000 years ago. Unlike simple, sharpened sticks or opportunistic use of bones, these tools were finely crafted. The barbed points in particular are striking. Long, slender bones carved with a series of backward-facing notches along their sides, creating a serrated edge. Anyone familiar with modern fish spears will recognise the design immediately. The barbs are there to prevent a slippery catch from wriggling free once struck. These were not improvised implements, but the product of careful shaping, skill, and repeated use. To imagine the people who made them is to picture humans who were not just hunters of land animals, but fishers of rivers. The Katanda harpoons suggest systematic exploitation of aquatic resources. In the layers where the tools were found, archaeologists also recovered remains of large catfish, some estimated to weigh more than 50 kilograms. These fish would have been formidable catches, requiring more than bare hands or casual spears. The barbed bone points show that people here had devised specialized technology for the task. This matters because fishing is not just another form of hunting. It represents a particular ecological strategy. Rivers and lakes provide a reliable, renewable source of protein and fat. Unlike large terrestrial animals, fish often gather in predictable places and can be harvested repeatedly without travelling long distances. To make and use harpoons for fishing is to establish a niche, a way of surviving that depends on exploiting aquatic ecosystems deliberately. And at Katanda, this was happening nearly 90,000 years ago. For decades, archaeologists assumed that such technology emerged much later, closer to 40 or 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens were already spreading across Eurasia. The Katanda finds forced a reconsideration. Here was evidence that people in Africa had long been capable of innovation and of developing complex tools suited to their environments. The harpoons are not an anomaly, but part of a growing recognition that African populations in the late Pleistocene were experimenting with a wide range of subsistence strategies. The craftsmanship of the Katanda points deserves attention. These are not crude or accidental forms. The barbs are evenly spaced, the shafts carefully thinned, the tips sharpened to penetrating points. Bone was chosen over stone for good reason. Its flexibility and lightness made it ideal for water hunting, less likely to shatter on impact and easier to haft onto a shaft. Some points show polish and were consistent with repeated use, suggesting they were part of a sustainable fishing practice. The knowledge required to make them implies teaching, imitation, and cultural continuity, and yet, questions remain. Were these harpoons used only for fishing, or also for hunting medium-sized animals on land? Bone points with barbs can work against mammals as well, though the concentration of fish remains at Katanda makes an aquatic use most likely. Did groups here specialise in fishing, or was it part of a broader mixed economy that also included hunting terrestrial animals and gathering plants? The evidence is not complete, but the presence of large catfish bones points toward fishing being a major, perhaps seasonal activity. What makes Katanda especially important is the glimpse it provides into the diversity of human adaptation. For too long, narratives of our species' past were dominated by images of hunters chasing large game across open plains. That did happen, of course, but humans were always more flexible than a single stereotype allows. At Katanda, we see a group that adapted to its local ecology, taking advantage of the abundance of riverine life. This flexibility, the ability to find food in different environments, was likely one of the keys to our survival and eventual expansion. But why here, and why then? The environmental context offers some clues. Around 90,000 years ago, Central Africa was marked by a complex mosaic of habitats, influenced by fluctuations in rainfall during the glacial cycles. Rivers like the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 would have been stable sources of water and food, especially during drier periods when terrestrial resources may have been scarcer. Large catfish are particularly suited to such habitats, able to thrive in slow-moving waters. Their seasonal spawning runs may have provided predictable surpluses that humans could exploit with barbed spears. To take advantage of such opportunities, people needed both the technology and the knowledge to use it effectively. There's also a social dimension to fishing. Unlike solitary big game hunting, fishing often lends itself to group activities. Multiple people can line a riverbank, working together to herd or spear fish. The returns can be shared among families. The repetitive nature of fishing may have provided space for social interaction, teaching, and storytelling. Around firelight at night, the day's catch could be roasted and consumed communally. The presence of durable tools like bone harpoons suggests a degree of planning and investment in a collective subsistence strategy. Of course, one must be cautious. We have only a limited sample of tools, preserved by chance. For all we know, bone harpoons were made in many places, most of which left no trace. Rivers shift, organic material decays, sites are buried. Katanda may be just the rare case where conditions preserved what was once more widespread. Still, the significance of what survives cannot be denied. These artifacts remind us that innovation did not appear suddenly in one place and time, but was part of a long, scattered and creative human story. The haunting question is whether fishing at Katanda was a one-time experiment or part of a deeper tradition. Did these people pass down their harpoon-making skills through generations, embedding them into their culture? Or was it a local innovation that arose and vanished, leaving only a brief trace in the archaeological record? We cannot be sure. The continuity of such practices is difficult to trace when the evidence is so fragmentary, yet the quality of the tools suggests that this was not the work of novices. These were craftspeople who knew what they were doing. Equally striking is what the Katanda harpoons tell us about human cognition. To make such a tool requires envisioning a problem, how to catch a slippery, fast-moving fish, and designing a solution that anticipates the struggle of the animal after it has been struck. The backward-facing barbs are a technological insight. They turn the spear into a trap that resists escape. This is problem-solving at a high level, involving abstract reasoning, planning, and skilled manipulation of materials. It shows that humans at this time were not only surviving, but innovating, thinking creatively about how to shape their world. The discovery of these harpoons also reshaped debates about when humans began to exploit aquatic environments systematically. Fish bones and shell middens appear in later sites around the world, but Katanda pushed the timeline back dramatically. It suggested that our ancestors' diets were broader and their technologies more diverse than previously assumed. This has implications for how we understand human evolution, because diets rich in fish and aquatic resources may have contributed important nutrients, such as fatty acids, that supported brain growth and function. While we must be cautious not to draw overly direct lines, the possibility that aquatic exploitation played a role in human evolution is a provocative one. It is also a reminder of how much remains unknown. For every Katanda, there are likely dozens of lost sites that could tell similar stories. Rivers flood, sediments bury, and the fragile remains of bone and fish decay. Archaeology is always incomplete, and our picture of the past is necessarily partial. Yet the tools from Katanda stand as durable witnesses to a moment when humans expanded their ecological repertoire in ways that echo into the present. Today, fishing is so commonplace that we barely register its antiquity. From industrial trawlers to handlines cast from riverbanks, it is part of daily life for millions. But at Katanda, 90,000 years ago, fishing with barbed bone harpoons was something new. It was a technological leap, a recognition that the rivers were not just obstacles to cross or sources of drinking water, but reservoirs of food to be tapped systematically. It was humans seeing rivers as opportunities and inventing the tools to claim them. The resolution is therefore both simple and profound. The Katanda harpoons tell us that by 90,000 years ago, our ancestors were already engineers of their ecosystems. They were making tools not only for land but for water, not only for hunting animals they could chase but for capturing those hidden beneath the surface. And that choice, to craft spears for rivers, was part of the long, uneven path that made us the adaptable species we are today. The haunting question remains: how many other technologies were invented and lost in the deep past, their traces erased, their stories forgotten? If not for a few barbed bone points in the soil of the Semliki Valley, we might still imagine that fishing was a late innovation. Instead, we know that humans were experimenting with rivers tens of thousands of years earlier than we expected. What else lies buried, waiting to remind us that our species' creativity is far older and far stranger than we usually dare to think? When did humans begin to bury their dead with care? It is a deceptively simple question, but one that touches the foundations of how we think about humanity itself. To put a body in the ground is not just a practical act of disposal, it can be an expression of care, of grief, of memory. Yet the earliest traces of burial are fragile, ambiguous, and often contested. In the layers of soil and stone that preserve our deep past, intention is difficult to prove. Was a body deliberately placed in the earth, or did it merely fall into a natural depression and get covered by sediment? Was the arrangement deliberate, or was it accidental? We tread carefully here, because we are asking about behaviours that lie at the boundary between biology and culture, between survival and meaning. One of the most moving glimpses we have comes from East Africa, in what is now Kenya. At a site called Panga Saidi, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a child buried nearly 78,000 years ago. The child, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, was found in a shallow pit. The bones were fragile, but the arrangement was clear enough to suggest careful placement. The head had been supported perhaps by a pillow of some sort that has since decayed, and the body seemed to have been laid to rest on its side, curled slightly as if in sleep. This was not random deposition. Someone dug a space, placed the child within it, and covered the body. For decades, burials this old were thought to exist mainly in Eurasia, particularly associated with Neanderthals. The Kenyan child pushed the African record deeper and challenged assumptions about where and when humans began to engage in such practices. The details are sparse, but the very act of deliberate burial suggests a relationship to the dead that went beyond mere disposal. It implies attention, a decision to mark the end of a life in a way that acknowledged its significance. Whether we call that ritual or not is a matter of interpretation, but the care is undeniable. There are other early hints as well. In the Middle East, several Neanderthal sites dating to around 100,000 years ago show possible evidence of intentional burial. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, skeletal remains of multiple individuals have been found in what appear to be dug pits. Some of these skeletons are articulated, meaning their bones were still in natural position when covered, which suggests they were not simply left on the surface. One famous skeleton, Shanidar 4, was once thought to be associated with pollen traces interpreted as flowers placed in the grave. That interpretation is debated today, with some arguing the pollen could have blown in naturally or been introduced by burrowing rodents. Still, the basic possibility of Neanderthals digging pits and placing their dead within them remains strong. Another site, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 Cave in Israel, contains burials of Homo sapiens individuals dated to around 100,000 years ago. Here too, skeletons appear in intentional pits, sometimes with signs of attention to body position. In one case, the arms of a child were placed across the chest, as though arranged by another hand. In another, the skull of an adult shows traces of burning, though whether this was part of a ritual or a post-depositional accident remains debated. Snail shells found nearby have been suggested as possible grave accompaniments, though it is always difficult to say whether they were symbolic or incidental. These early burials, in Africa, in the Levant, and among Neanderthals in Eurasia, suggest that by around 100,000 years ago, multiple human populations were engaging in the practice of placing their dead in the ground. The reasons, however, are not fully known. Practical considerations may have played a role. A buried body is less accessible to scavengers and less likely to spread disease. Digging a pit may have been a way to control hygiene in a community setting, but the careful positioning of bodies and the possible inclusion of objects point to something more. These were not simply corpses to be hidden. They were individuals remembered and given a place. Archaeologists are cautious about reading too much into this. The line between practical burial and symbolic ritual is thin, and it is easy to project modern sentiments into the past. Yet even the act of protection, of covering a body so that it is not disturbed, can be seen as a form of care. In the Kenyan child burial, the suggestion of a pillow beneath the head is especially poignant. It tells us that the living saw the dead child not as refused but as someone to be treated gently, as though asleep. We also must consider the broader context. Burial is not universal even today. Many human societies have developed alternative ways of dealing with the dead exposure on the surface: cremation, deposition in water. The fact that some groups buried their dead in the deep past does not mean all did. Indeed, the rarity of burials in the archaeological record suggests that most bodies were not buried at all, or at least not in ways that preserved. Many may have been left on the surface, where bones were scattered by animals and weathered to dust. Others may have been placed in shallow graves that left no lasting trace. What survives is only a small sample of what once occurred. The comparison between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in this regard is illuminating. Both groups seem to have engaged in burial practices, though the frequency and style varied. Some Neanderthal burials are relatively simple, a body placed in a pit with no apparent additions. Others show more complex arrangements. For Homo sapiens in places like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and later Skull Cave, there are hints of additional gesture shells, pigment, or deliberate body positioning. The Kenyan child adds an African dimension, reminding us that such practices were not confined to Eurasia. What is striking is that burial seems to emerge independently in different populations around the same broad time frame. This suggests that the behaviour was within the cognitive and cultural capacities of multiple human groups. It may have arisen not from one single origin point, but from a shared human tendency to treat the dead differently from the living. Once communities began to reflect on death, perhaps through the loss of children or elders, the impulse to do something more than leave the body behind may have been nearly inevitable. The Kenyan child burial also raises another question. How do we distinguish burial from mere deposition? A pit could be natural, a depression filled by accident. But the articulation of the skeleton, the protection of the skull, and the possible pillow beneath it are all strong indications of intentionality. Archaeologists look for such patterns: the position of limbs, the completeness of skeletons, the presence of enclosing pits. The more deliberate these features appear, the more confident we can be that the burial was purposeful, and yet certainty is elusive. Soil moves, bones collapse, sediments intrude. What looks like intention may sometimes be coincidence. This is why every claim of early burial is carefully scrutinized, debated, sometimes doubted. But as more cases accumulate, in Africa, in the Levant, in Neanderthal caves, the weight of evidence grows. Burial in some form was clearly part of human behaviour by 100,000 years ago. It is important to note that burial alone does not prove symbolic thought or religious belief. A body in a pit could be purely practical. But when we see consistent care in placement, or the inclusion of objects, or the suggestion of protection, we begin to glimpse something more. Perhaps these communities were developing the earliest traditions of mourning, of memory, of ritual. Perhaps they were beginning to treat death not only as a biological end, but as a social moment requiring response. From a broader perspective, the emergence of burial marks a turning point in the human relationship to mortality. Other animals react to death. Elephants linger around bones. Primates sometimes carry the bodies of infants for days. But systematic burial is rare outside of humans and our close relatives. By choosing to inter their dead, humans were beginning to separate themselves from the natural cycle of decay. They were intervening, shaping the fate of the body, and in doing so, shaping their relationship to the idea of loss. The haunting resolution is this. By 100,000 years ago, the living were already pausing to care for the dead. Whether in the curled body of a Kenyan child, the arranged skeletons of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, or the dug pits of Neanderthal caves, we see the beginnings of a tradition that would expand into cemeteries, tombs, and eventually vast necropolises. The details differ, the meanings shift, but the impulse endures. To bury is to remember, to protect, and to acknowledge. And so the question lingers. Was this the moment when humans first began to see each other not only as living beings, but as stories that continued even after breath had ended? Who else was thriving in Eurasia when we first arrived? To imagine the world of 120 to 100,000 years ago, we must turn our attention north and west, away from Africa, to a continent shaped by advancing ice sheets, variable climates, and a different kind of human. This was the age of the Neanderthals at their peak. Their population stretched from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia, through the forests and river valleys of Central Europe, across the steppes that bordered the Caspian, and into the mountains of Western Asia. They were not scattered exceptions, but dominant inhabitants of these lands for hundreds of thousands of years. When we picture Neanderthals today, it is often through the lens of caricature or cliché. Brutish cave dwellers, shaggy and stooped. But the archaeological record paints a more nuanced picture. They were powerful, stocky, and cold-adapted, with barrel-like chests and muscular limbs. Their bones show heavy use, evidence of strenuous activity in demanding landscapes. They were not merely survivors on the fringes of ice sheets, but active hunters, builders of shelters, and long-term residents of caves. To them, Eurasia was not a hostile environment. It was home. The Neanderthal range was impressive. Fossils and tools show their presence in Spain and France, in Germany and Italy, in the Balkans and Ukraine, all the way toward the Caspian Basin. They were not confined to one habitat, but occupied temperate woodlands, open steppe, and mountain valleys. This adaptability suggests not only biological robustness, but also a degree of behavioral flexibility. They understood the rhythms of local environments, where herds migrated, where rivers froze, where caves provided shelter from bitter winds. Caves indeed became some of the most enduring traces of Neanderthal life. Many of the famous sites we know today, La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, Shanidar in Iraq, Vindija in Croatia, are caves where Neanderthal remains accumulated over generations. These were not mere stopovers. Evidence suggests repeated occupation, with hearths, stone tools, butchered animal bones, and occasionally burials marking them as hubs of activity. A cave could serve as a seasonal base, a place of refuge during harsh winters, or a communal centre where tasks like tool-making and food preparation took place. Their hunting strategies reveal further sophistication. For a long time, Neanderthals were thought to be primarily scavengers, eking out a living on the leftovers of other predators. But isotopic studies of their bones, combined with the archaeological record of animal remains, tell a different story. They were apex hunters, capable of bringing down large game like red deer, bison, and even mammoth. Sites across Europe show clear evidence of systematic butchery, with cut marks on bones and marrow extraction, suggesting not chance finds but organised hunting and processing. The methods were not simple. Bringing down large dangerous animals required planning, cooperation, and courage. Some sites indicate that Neanderthals used ambush tactics, driving animals into natural traps like ravines or swamps. Others suggest they coordinated attacks to wound and wear down prey. The injuries seen in Neanderthal skeletons, broken bones, healed fractures, mirror those of rodeo riders today, hinting at the dangers of close-contact hunting with thrusting spears. Hunting was not a passive affair. It was intimate, physical, and risky. Their diet extended beyond meat. Plant remains, starch grains on stone tools, and traces of cooked vegetation in dental calculus suggest that Neanderthals gathered and prepared plant foods as well. They roasted tubers, processed seeds, and likely made use of whatever local flora was available. This challenges the old image of Neanderthals as strictly carnivorous, and instead points to a broader, more balanced subsistence strategy. They were not simply predators, but opportunists, adjusting their diet to the seasons and the landscape. By 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals had developed distinct stone tool traditions. The so-called Mousterian industry, characterized by flake tools produced through the Levallois technique, dominates their record. This method involved carefully preparing a stone core and then striking flakes of predetermined shape, allowing for standardized points, scrapers, and cutting edges. It required skill, foresight, and an understanding of fracture mechanics. These tools were effective for butchering, hide preparation, woodworking, and hunting. They represent a cultural tradition maintained and transmitted across generations. The Caspian region and Central Asia offer fascinating glimpses into the eastern limits of Neanderthal range. Here, in places like Uzbekistan and the Altai Mountains, Neanderthal remains intermingle with evidence of other hominin populations. Their ability to expand into these environments demonstrates remarkable resilience. The climate was harsh, with cold winters and scarce resources, yet Neanderthals persisted. They established themselves in caves and open-air sites, hunted local fauna, and adapted to conditions far from their European core. This reach suggests a population that was not static but exploratory, capable of pushing into new ecological zones. We can imagine, then, a Eurasia where Neanderthals were the primary human presence. From Iberia to the Caspian, they were the ones who knew the terrain. who tracked herds across frozen ground, who lit fires in caves during long winters. Their population densities were not high by modern standards, perhaps only a few thousand spread across vast regions, but they were enough to leave a deep imprint on the landscape. Yet for all their presence, there is still much we do not know. Did they have long-term territories, defended against outsiders, or did groups range more fluidly across the land? How large were their social units? Estimates suggest groups of perhaps 10 to 30 individuals, bands that came together for hunting or resource gathering, but the details remain elusive. What we do know is that they endured. For hundreds of thousands of years through multiple glacial cycles, Neanderthals held their ground. The archaeological record also reveals their relationship with fire. Hearths appear regularly in Neanderthal sites, indicating control and habitual use. Fire was essential for warmth, cooking, and protection. It may also have played roles in social cohesion, as it does for us today, serving as a focal point for group activity. The ability to maintain fire in cold climates was not optional, but necessary, and Neanderthals mastered it. One haunting aspect of the Neanderthal record is the evidence of injury and survival. Many skeletons show signs of trauma, yet also of healing. This implies that injured individuals were cared for by others, receiving food and protection during recovery. Such care suggests social bonds strong enough to sustain members who could not immediately contribute. It hints at communities bound by cooperation and concern, not simply by necessity. By 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals were thriving, not declining. Their range was broad, their populations resilient, their cultural traditions stable. When Homo sapiens began to push into Eurasia during this period, it was into a world already occupied by these formidable relatives. Far from being primitive or marginal, Neanderthals were masters of their environment, dominant hunters and established inhabitants. The haunting question, then, is not whether Neanderthals were successful. They clearly were. It is why, after such long tenure, they eventually disappeared. But that is a question for later in the story. For now, in the window of 120 to 100,000 years ago, Eurasia was their zone. They were not shadows waiting to be replaced. They were the humans of their lands, shaping the rhythms of life across Europe and Western Asia. And the caves they left behind still whisper of fires once lit, hunts once undertaken, and lives once lived fully in landscapes that were theirs long before we arrived. Were Neanderthals thinking symbolically before us? It is a question that hovers uneasily in the background of nearly every discovery linked to them. For much of the 20th century, the assumption was clear. Symbolic thought, art, and ritual belonged to us alone. Homo sapiens, the so-called modern humans. Neanderthals were seen as pragmatic, physical, focused on survival, but without the spark of abstraction that underpinned language, art, and culture. Yet as excavation after excavation has peeled back the layers of European caves and rock shelters, that neat division has eroded. What has emerged instead is a picture of a people who, 100,000 years ago, may already have been experimenting with meaning in ways that challenge our long-standing sense of uniqueness. One of the most striking finds comes from a site in Croatia called Krapina. Here, in layers dated to roughly 130 to 100,000 years ago, archaeologists recovered not only bones of Neanderthals, but also a curious collection of eagle talons. At first glance, talons might appear to be little more than refuse from hunting or scavenging. But these were not ordinary remains. Several showed cut marks and striations consistent with deliberate modification. Some bore polishing along their edges, as if strung together or worn against skin or leather. When the pieces were assembled and studied, it became clear that Neanderthals at Krapina had intentionally collected eagle talons and altered them into what looks very much like personal ornaments, perhaps necklaces, pendants, or other forms of display. Why talons? Eagles are not easy animals to catch. To obtain their talons required effort, risk, and determination. This alone suggests significance beyond mere utility. These were not tools. They do not cut, scrape, or pierce effectively. They are trophies of a kind, but not the sort that fills a stomach. If they were worn, they might have conveyed identity, status, or affiliation. They might have symbolized prowess, courage, or connection to the animal world. We cannot know precisely, but the evidence resists dismissal. At Krapina, Neanderthals were using body ornaments tens of thousands of years before similar traditions appear securely in our own species. A different kind of evidence comes from bones themselves, not of animals, but of Neanderthals. At sites such as Crapina and El Sidron in Spain, researchers have found Neanderthal skeletal remains with cut marks in places that suggest more than simple butchery. Some interpretations point toward cannibalism in times of scarcity, but others hint at something more ambiguous: the deliberate manipulation of skulls and bones in patterned ways. At Crapina, fragments of Neanderthal skulls show signs of intentional processing, including removal of the braincase roof and polishing of edges. These modifications might represent practical processing of flesh, but they might also represent symbolic treatment of the dead. The line is difficult to draw. Was this survival cannibalism, ritual defleshing, or some form of ancestral veneration? The bones are silent, but the patterns of modification echo practices seen much later among our own ancestors, where ritual treatment of human remains was deeply tied to ideas of memory, spirit, and continuity. Another thread in this emerging tapestry is the presence of ochre. Red ochre, an iron-rich mineral pigment, has been recovered from Neanderthal contexts as far back as 100,000 years ago. At sites in southern Europe, lumps of ochre appear in association with Mousterian tools and hearths. Some pieces bear grinding or scraping marks, suggesting deliberate processing into powder. Ochre has limited functional use in hunting or survival. It does not cut, preserve, or feed. What it does do is colour. It stains skin, hides, and objects with a deep red hue, a colour long associated by humans with blood, life, and death. If Neanderthals were grinding ochre and applying it, it raises the possibility that they were marking bodies, tools, or spaces in symbolic ways. Once again, we cannot know their intentions, but the very choice to collect and alter such minerals signals an interest in more than function. Perhaps the most enigmatic piece of this puzzle lies in the depths of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 in southwestern France. Discovered in the 1990s and dated more securely in recent years, this site contains one of the most extraordinary Neanderthal constructions known. Some 350 metres inside the cave, far beyond the reach of natural light, archaeologists found a circular structure built from broken stalagmites. The pieces had been deliberately snapped, transported, and arranged into rings and piles, with traces of fire and scorching on some of them. Uranium-thorium dating places this construction at around 176,000 years ago, well before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. The Bruniquel Circle defies simple explanation. It is not a habitation site. The depth of the cave, the absence of ordinary living debris, and the effort required to build it all suggest something else. Was it a shelter from predators? A storage structure? Unlikely. The scale and location point instead toward a symbolic or ritual purpose. To enter such depths with firelight, to break stalagmites and arrange them into precise forms, implies intention beyond subsistence. Some archaeologists argue that Bruniquel represents a form of proto-ritual space, a gathering point for Neanderthals to engage in practices we can only dimly imagine. Whatever its meaning, it is one of the earliest known constructions made in the deep dark of a cave, a place humans, including us, have long reserved for acts of symbolism, storytelling, and ritual. When we weave these strands together, eagle talon ornaments, modified human bones, ochre use, and the Bruniquel Circle, a picture emerges of Neanderthals as beings who at least dabbled in symbolism. They did not simply live in the world. They interpreted it, transformed it, and imbued it with patterns of meaning. This does not mean they thought exactly like us. Symbolism takes many forms, and our categories of art or ritual may not apply neatly. But the evidence demands that we take seriously the possibility that Neanderthals were experimenting with the same cognitive territory we hold so dear to our humanity. The haunting question is whether these were isolated sparks or part of a broader fire. Were the ornaments at Crapina rare oddities, the eccentric creations of a few individuals, or were they expressions of a tradition shared across groups? Was the Bruniquel Circle a one-time construction, or did Neanderthals across Europe build similar spaces that have yet to be discovered? The fragmentary nature of the record means we cannot answer. Each site offers tantalizing glimpses, not a full portrait. But the direction is unmistakable. Neanderthals were not strangers to symbolism. They may have lived in worlds of meaning that overlapped more with ours than we once imagined. If so, then the neat boundary once drawn between us and them begins to dissolve. The story of symbolic thought is not a sudden light switch flicked on by Homo sapiens. It may be a slow kindling, sparked at different times and places by different human species, Neanderthals among them. And that realization unsettles the old hierarchies. The last apes to rival us in size were not only hunters of mammoth and makers of stone, they were also wearers of eagle talons, arrangers of stalagmites, grinders of red pigment, and perhaps, in their own way, storytellers in the dark. Who are the humans we know mostly through DNA? It is a strange question because for most of the story of paleoanthropology, bones came first. A femur, a jaw, a tooth, a skull. These were the anchors of speculation, the solid fragments around which narratives were woven. But in the case of the Denisovans, it has been almost the reverse. We know them not by the weight of skeletons or the breadth of archaeological sites, but by faint traces of their genome, extracted from tiny fragments and scattered remains. They are perhaps the most spectral of all our relatives, a people who left more of themselves inside our cells than they did in the dirt of history. The first hint of their existence was uncovered not so long ago, in a place already famous for its long human record. Denisova Cave, located in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, had been excavated for decades. Its deposits recorded not just human activity, but tens of thousands of years of environmental change. It was here, in the twilight layers of a cave that had seen Neanderthals and later our own kind, that a fragment of bone was found in 2008. At first it was unremarkable, a sliver of phalanx bone from the finger of a juvenile individual, so small that it could have easily been dismissed. But advances in genetic sequencing made it possible to analyse its DNA, and what came back was unexpected. This was not the genome of a Neanderthal, nor of a modern human. It belonged to a distinct population, closely related to Neanderthals but separate, a branch that had split off hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The scientists named them after the cave itself, the Denisovans, and with that, a new ghost lineage entered the human story. The puzzle deepened as more material was sequenced. Teeth recovered from the same cave, unusually large molars with robust crowns yielded the same genetic signature. These were not outliers. They belonged to the same population as the finger bone, yet the molars were so massive that, had they been found in isolation, they might have been assigned to an archaic hominin species, rather than to something so close to Neanderthals. The Denisovans, it seemed, combined familiar genetic kinship with surprising dental morphology, a combination that raised more questions than it answered. And then came one of the most remarkable finds of all. In 2012, a fragment of long bone recovered from Denisova Cave was sequenced. Its genome revealed something extraordinary. The individual, nicknamed Denny, was the direct offspring of two different human groups. Her mother a Neanderthal, her father a Denisovan. This was not population-level admixture reconstructed statistically. This was a single hybrid individual, a first-generation child of two distinct kinds of human. It was proof, in the most intimate way possible, that Neanderthals and Denisovans not only coexisted, but also interbred, leaving behind children whose lives remain invisible except through their DNA. The presence of Denisovans in the Altai might suggest they were limited to this cold corner of Siberia, but their genetic legacy tells a different story. Traces of Denisovan DNA appear today in populations far from Siberia. People in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Southeast Asia carry significant percentages of Denisovan ancestry, sometimes as high as 5%. This suggests that Denisovans ranged widely, perhaps across Asia, and interbred with modern humans in multiple regions. They were not just a local population. They were a continent-spanning presence whose bones are nearly absent from the fossil record, yet whose genetic fingerprints remain vivid in living humans. The archaeological traces of Denisovans are thin, and this absence has forced scientists to rely on indirect evidence. What material culture can be tied to them? At Denisova Cave, artifacts associated with their layers include stone tools and, intriguingly, personal ornaments such as a polished greenstone bracelet with a drilled hole, dated to tens of thousands of years ago, but the problem is attribution. The cave was used by Neanderthals, Denisovans, and later Homo sapiens. Layers overlap, sediments mix, and direct association between artifacts and species is rare. It is entirely possible that some of the symbolic artifacts in Denisova Cave belong to modern humans who arrived later. The Denisovans remain archaeologically silent, at least in ways we can confidently assign. Outside the cave, a jawbone found on the Tibetan plateau added a new piece to the puzzle. Discovered in Bashir Karst Cave and dated to at least 160,000 years ago, this robust mandible, with its large molars and absence of a chin, was later shown through protein analysis to belong to a Denisovan. This was stunning for several reasons. First, it placed Denisovans not just in Siberia, but also on the high-altitude Tibetan plateau, far from the Altai Mountains. Second, it suggested they were well adapted to extreme environments. In fact, one of the most famous Denisovan genetic contributions to modern humans involves the EPAS1 gene, which today helps Tibetan populations cope with low-oxygen environments at high elevations. That adaptation appears to have been inherited from Denisovans, who had already mastered such landscapes. Taken together, these fragments sketch an outline of a people who are widespread, adaptable, and deeply intertwined with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Yet their material presence remains elusive. We have no Denisovan skeletons to study, no complete skulls, no clear sense of what they looked like in life. Reconstructions vary wildly. Some portray them as robust Neanderthal-like figures, others as closer to modern humans. The truth is that we do not know. With so little fossil evidence, their faces remain hidden in the shadows of prehistory. What we do know comes primarily from their DNA, and that DNA keeps reshaping our view. It shows that Denisovans split from Neanderthals several 100,000 years ago, after both had branched off from the line that led to us. It shows multiple episodes of interbreeding, not only with Neanderthals but also with modern humans in Asia and Oceania. It reveals adaptations, like the high-altitude gene, that still shape human survival today. In a sense, Denisovans are both gone and not gone. Their bones are rare, but their genes live on, woven into the genomes of millions. The haunting question is why the record is so empty. Did Denisovans occupy regions where fossil preservation is poor? Did their populations exist at densities too low to leave many remains? Or have we simply not yet found the right sites? Given their genetic legacy, they must have been numerous enough and widespread enough to leave lasting marks. And yet, aside from a finger, a few teeth, and a jaw, they remain almost invisible. It is one of the greatest mysteries of human prehistory. A people who mattered profoundly to our genetic story, but who left so little behind for archaeology to hold. Perhaps the Denisovans remind us of how provisional our reconstructions are. Entire human populations can vanish into the soil with only the faintest trace. Their lives, their faces, their rituals may be gone, but a few fragments and a string of nucleotides whisper that they were here, in the shadows of caves, in the thin air of the plateau, in the cells of people alive today. The Denisovans persist as both presence and absence. They are proof that the story of humanity is not only about what we can see, but also about what we can only infer, dimly, from echoes. And the question that lingers is simple, yet vast. How many other human groups are still hidden from us, waiting in the genetic dust of a forgotten bone to speak their name? How long did the first upright human survive? The question hangs heavy because Homo erectus was not a brief experiment. This species, first emerging in Africa nearly 2 million years ago, lasted through climates, continents, and cycles of ice and warmth longer than almost any other human lineage. They were there before us, before Neanderthals, before Denisovans. They were the pioneers who first left Africa, the first to stride across Asia, and the first to build a life outside the narrow savannas of their origins. And yet, by 108,000 years ago, they were clinging to existence in just one place, the island of Java. Java had been home to Homo erectus for a staggering length of time. Fossil discoveries from sites like Trinil, Sangaran and Ngandong tell a story that stretches back at least 1.5 million years. These were the Java men, first described in the late 19th century, whose bones forced scientists to reckon with a deep human past far older than biblical chronologies allowed. The flat plains and river valleys of Java became a time capsule, preserving wave after wave of Erectus presence, from from their first arrival to their final stand. To imagine a single lineage enduring in one place for that long is almost beyond comprehension. It means that the ancestors of these late surviving Erectus had already been walking the island when glaciers waxed and waned far away, when other hominins rose and fell, when entire ecosystems shifted, and still they endured. The Ngandung fossils are the most striking evidence for their late survival. Found near the Solo River in the early 20th century, these 12 skull caps and 2 tibiae became the centre of one of paleoanthropology's longest debates. For decades, scholars could not agree on their age. Some argued they were as old as 500,000 years, others as young as 50,000. The uncertainty persisted because dating river sediments is notoriously difficult. Floods mix deposits, bones get reworked, and establishing a secure context can be elusive. But recent work using advanced dating techniques has provided clarity. Multiple methods, including uranium series and luminescence dating, converge on an age of around 108,000 to 117,000 years ago. If those dates are correct, Homo erectus survived on Java until long after Neanderthals dominated Europe and Denisovans spread through Asia, and just as Homo sapiens were beginning their first forays beyond Africa. What did these late Erectus look like? Their skulls show the classic features: thick cranial bones, low sloping foreheads, pronounced brow ridges, and brain sizes smaller than ours but not insignificant. They averaged around 900 cubic centimetres, sometimes more, which is within range of the early Homo sapiens. Yet their overall shape remained archaic, a holdover from a much older human design. Their bodies were sturdy, well built for walking and persistence hunting, but perhaps less versatile than those of later humans. In their bones we see continuity, a lineage that changed little for hundreds of thousands of years, as though stability was their evolutionary strategy. Why did they survive so long in Java, when they had disappeared elsewhere? One answer may be geography. Java, periodically connected to mainland Asia by land bridges when sea levels dropped, was also isolated when seas rose. That isolation could have provided refuge, shielding Homo erectus from competition with newer hominins sweeping through the continent. Another answer lies in ecology. The rivers and forests of Java were rich with resources. Ungulates, water buffalo, rhinoceroses, and even elephants roamed its landscapes. Erectus, with their simple stone tools and scavenging hunting strategies, may have been well suited to exploiting these environments without needing dramatic innovation. But this apparent stability has led to a controversial interpretation. Some researchers, looking at the Ngandung evidence, have suggested that Homo erectus may have faded because of a kind of evolutionary conservatism. Their stone tools remained simple, classified as part of the core and flake technologies that had changed little in hundreds of thousands of years. Compared to the prepared, core techniques of contemporaneous Neanderthals or the blade industries of early Homo sapiens, Erectus technology looks static. One provocative theory has even called them lazy, arguing that they did not transport stone over long distances or refine their toolkits the way other humans did. This characterization is debated, and perhaps unfair. What looks like stagnation may instead have been sufficiency. If their tools worked for the tasks they faced, why change them? Simplicity is not necessarily inferiority. It may reflect adaptation to stable conditions. Climate, however, does not remain stable forever. Around 120,000 years ago, Earth entered a warm interglacial period. Sea levels rose, submerging the Sunda Shelf that had once connected Java to mainland Asia. Forests expanded and contracted in unpredictable pulses. Floodplains shifted, rivers meandered, and the mosaic of habitats that had sustained Homo erectus may have changed in ways that reduced their food supply. Some large mammals disappeared or retreated, altering the ecological balance. In such shifting landscapes, a species finely tuned to old conditions can find itself maladapted. Did Homo erectus encounter other humans in their final centuries? That is a question without a clear answer. By the time they were surviving in Java, modern humans had not yet established themselves across the island chain, though evidence from nearby regions suggests early movements. It is possible that small groups of Homo sapiens or Denisovans passed through Southeast Asia before Erectus vanished. If contact occurred, it may have been fleeting, leaving no trace in the fossil record. Unlike the interbreeding seen between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and our species, there is no genetic signal of Homo erectus in living humans. Their lineage seems to have ended without passing into ours, a branch cut clean. The haunting element of their story is how close they came to overlapping with us in time. While Homo sapiens in Africa were experimenting with symbolic behaviour and beginning migrations outward, Homo erectus in Java were still carrying on traditions that had endured for over 1 million years. For thousands of years, both species may have been alive on the same planet, unaware of each other. It is only the luck of geography that kept them apart, one lineage on its last island, the other preparing to spread everywhere. The extinction of Homo erectus was not dramatic in the way we often imagine. There was no single catastrophe that erased them. Rather, it seems to have been a slow dwindling, a gradual failure to keep pace with changing climates and landscapes. Perhaps their populations were already small and fragmented, vulnerable to local extinctions. Perhaps their reliance on certain habitats left them unable to adapt when those habitats shifted. By the time the last groups walked the riverbanks of Nyandong, they were the end of a lineage that had once ruled half the world. When we speak of borrowed time, it is not to diminish their achievements, but to recognise their endurance. Homo erectus lasted longer than any of us have so far. If our species were to vanish tomorrow, we would not have matched their span. They were the true survivors, the steady walkers who outlived almost everything else in the human family. Their disappearance is not just a story of failure, it is also a reminder of how tenuous survival can be, even for the most enduring. And so the question lingers, as it always does with the vanished. What did the last Homo erectus see, standing on the banks of the Solo River more than 100,000 years ago? Did they watch the elephants move through the trees, the crocodiles slide into the water, the flocks of birds rising into the humid sky? Did they sense, in some animal way, that theirs was the final generation of a story that had begun nearly 2 million years earlier? We will never know. What we do know is that they were there, on borrowed time, holding on to existence until the island, the climate, and the world itself moved on without them. Could you meet a 3-foot-tall human and call them kin? That is not a riddle, though it sounds like one. It is the story of a very real discovery on a small Indonesian island, where bones of a tiny human challenged every assumption about who counted as us. These beings have been given the name Homo floresiensis, but most people know them by the nickname that immediately stuck, the Hobbits. They were small, they were strange, and for tens of thousands of years they shared the world with our kind. The discovery happened in 2003 in a limestone cave called 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 on the island of Flores. Archaeologists digging there expected to find traces of the modern humans, maybe evidence of early migration. Instead, they uncovered the nearly complete skeleton of a female who had lived about 60,000 years ago. She stood barely over 1 metre tall, had a tiny brain less than 400 cubic centimetres in volume, and yet her skeleton bore the hallmarks of a fully upright walker, a toolmaker, a hunter. She was not a child, not diseased, but an adult of a species nobody had ever imagined. From that moment, the debates began. Some scientists argued she must have been a pathological Homo sapiens, a modern human with a severe disorder like microcephaly that stunted growth and shrank the brain. But that explanation quickly unravelled as more bones emerged. Other individuals from the same cave showed the same proportions, their arm and leg bones, their feet, their jaws, all consistent with a small-bodied human species, not a one-off anomaly. The picture solidified. On Flores, for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, a population of tiny humans had lived and thrived. How did they get there? The origins of Homo floresiensis remain one of the great puzzles. Flores has never been connected to the Asian mainland, even at the lowest sea levels. To reach it requires crossing open water, a challenge even for modern seafarers. And yet, some early humans managed it. One theory suggests that ancestors of Homo floresiensis, perhaps early migrants resembling Homo erectus, arrived on rafts of vegetation washed out by storms or tsunamis. Ocean currents could have carried them across the straits. Once on the island, they adapted to its peculiar environment in ways that still astonish us. That adaptation took the form of island dwarfism, a well-documented evolutionary response in mammals. On islands where resources are limited and large predators absent, big animals often shrink over generations, conserving energy and thriving at smaller body sizes. The same process works in reverse for small animals, which sometimes grow larger when freed from predators. Flores was a perfect laboratory. The island hosted dwarf elephants called stegodon, some only the size of a cow. It harboured giant storks and giant monitor lizards, including ancestors of the Komodo dragon. Into this mix came a human lineage, and the result was a species reduced to half our height, with small brains but sophisticated survival strategies. The brain size of Homo floresiensis has always been a sticking point. At about 400 cubic centimetres, it is smaller than that of a chimpanzee. And yet, at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and nearby sites, archaeologists found stone tools clearly associated with these beings. They made flakes, points, and cutting edges from local rocks, tools sufficient for hunting stegodon calves and butchering carcasses. Some evidence even suggests they controlled fire, though this remains debated. The key point is that brain volume alone does not dictate intelligence. The structure of the brain, the density of its wiring, and the cultural practices of a group matter as much or more than sheer size. Homo floresiensis, whatever their mental world, were capable of sustaining a population for tens of millennia. Their world was not empty. On Flores, they would have shared the land with crocodiles, giant birds, and the formidable Komodo dragons, which could reach lengths of 3 meters. To survive among such animals required cunning and cooperation. The dwarf elephants were a crucial resource, but also a challenge. Full-grown adults may have been too large to hunt, but the young would have been vulnerable. The stone tools found at sites like Matamenga, another locality on Flores, show a tradition stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, possibly to the ancestors of Homo floresiensis. This continuity suggests they were not accidental visitors, but a long-term, stable presence. Dating the remains has refined our understanding of their timeline. Initially, some researchers believed they survived until as recently as 12,000 years ago, which would have placed them almost within the reach of oral traditions. Later dating, however, revised this. The bones from 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 belong to individuals who lived between about 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. That still means they were contemporaries of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens. At a time when multiple human lineages walked the earth, Flores was home to one of the strangest. The haunting part of the story is how recently they vanished. If Homo floresiensis was still alive 60,000 years ago, that overlaps with the period when our species was spreading across Asia. It raises the possibility, however fleeting, that humans and hobbits could have encountered one another. Did they meet on riverbanks or in forests? Did our ancestors recognize them as kin or as something alien? No evidence confirms contact, but the potential is difficult to ignore. Another haunting element lies in folklore. Local traditions on Flores speak of small, hairy people called the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, said to have lived in caves, spoken in murmurs, and stolen food from villagers. These tales persisted into the 19th century, long before the bones were found. Some suggest these are just myths, retrofitted onto the discovery. Others wonder if memory of real encounters with diminutive humans could have filtered down through oral tradition. It is speculation, not evidence, but in a world where hobbits once truly lived, it is tempting to imagine. The broader significance of Homo floresiensis is that they forced us to question the neat ladder of human evolution we once imagined. For much of the 20th century, the story was told as a straight line, from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. The hobbits shattered that simplicity. Here was a species with a tiny brain, small stature, and archaic features living at the same time as the large-brained humans who painted caves and built tools of extraordinary sophistication. Evolution, it turns out, is not a ladder but a branching bush, full of side paths and experiments. Their extinction, like that of so many human lineages, remains mysterious. Climate shifts on the island may have played a role. Volcanic eruptions are another possibility, as Flores lies in a geologically active zone. The arrival of modern humans, if it occurred before 60,000 years ago, could also have pressured them through competition. But without direct evidence, all we can say is that by 50,000 years ago, the hobbits were gone. And so we are left with a paradox. Homo floresiensis was tiny, isolated, and fragile in some ways, yet they endured for an immense span of time. They remind us that being human is not one fixed shape, not one brain size, not one height. Humanity has been a spectrum, a set of overlapping experiments. The hobbits just happened to take a path towards smallness, an evolutionary solution that worked until it didn't. The question that lingers is a personal one. If you had stood in 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐏 Cave 60,000 years ago and met a 3-foot-tall woman with a tiny skull and ancient features, would you have recognised her as family? Or would you have recoiled, seeing only difference? Our science tells us she was human, but a human unlike any we expected. In that recognition lies a larger truth. The human story has always been stranger, broader, and more varied than the one we tell ourselves. The hobbits are gone, but their bones sit in museums, their story travels through classrooms, and their memory lives in the strange twist of knowing that once, not so long ago, another kind of human walked the earth. Short, small, and utterly real. How did humans cross oceans before boats were invented? It sounds like the setup to a science fiction story, but it is a real problem facing archaeologists today. The evidence is not theoretical. It lies in bones and teeth dug out of a cave on the Philippine island of Luzon, bones that belong to a kind of human nobody expected to find there. These remains, announced in 2019, were given the name Homo luzonensis. They force us to imagine how small groups of ancient people managed to reach islands across treacherous waters long before sails, oars, or even the most primitive dugout canoes are known in the archaeological record. The site of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐏 Cave in northern Luzon yielded the crucial fossils. The first clue appeared in 2007, when a single foot bone was unearthed and dated to more than 60,000 years ago. A decade later, deeper excavations produced more bones, teeth, finger bones, and other fragments. Together they revealed an anatomy unlike that of modern humans, but also not identical to known archaic species. The molars were unusually small, the premolars oddly shaped, the curved finger and toe bones reminiscent of even earlier hominins. It was a mosaic of traits, a body built from evolutionary parts that seemed out of place in late Pleistocene Southeast Asia. Whoever these people were, they were small, likely less than 4 feet tall. Their anatomy suggested adaptations to life in rugged, forested environments, perhaps with a strong climbing ability. That alone was surprising, because climbing adapted humans were thought to have vanished hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Yet here they were, clinging to life on a Philippine island while across Eurasia, larger-bodied Neanderthals and Denisovans thrived. The bigger question was how they got to Luzon in the first place. Unlike some continental shelves that were exposed during Ice Age sea level lows, Luzon has always been an island separated from the Asian mainland by deep ocean trenches. Even when glaciers locked up vast amounts of water and sea levels fell by more than 100 metres, the gaps remained too wide to walk. The only way onto Luzon was across open sea. This is where the puzzle begins. Did archaic humans build watercraft we have not yet found? Or were they carried accidentally, swept by storms onto natural rafts of vegetation torn from riverbanks? Both scenarios strain our imagination, but both are plausible. In 2018, archaeologists discovered stone tools and butchered rhinoceros bones at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐏 on Luzon, dated to more than 700,000 years ago. That evidence shows that some kind of human, not necessarily Homo luzonensis, perhaps their ancestor, had already reached the island unimaginably early. This pushes the problem back further. If humans were on Luzon hundreds of thousands of years ago, then ocean crossings without boats were not rare accidents. They must have happened multiple times. This raises the possibility that ocean crossings were within the capacity of archaic humans far earlier than we assumed. Perhaps they had knowledge of floating on logs, or clinging to rafts of bamboo and driftwood, or simply pushing into the waves and trusting currents to carry them. What we know for sure is that Luzon was populated long before our species arrived, and that an isolated lineage evolved there into something distinct. Insular dwarfism appears again in this story. On islands with limited food resources, smaller body sizes can become advantageous. Large animals often shrink in such conditions, and humans are no exception. Over thousands of generations, the Luzon population may have reduced in size until their bodies fit the island's ecological niche. Small size meant lower calorie needs, easier mobility in dense forest, and perhaps greater success in an environment without large prey but with many challenges. The material culture associated with Homo luzonensis remains elusive. Unlike some sites where tools are abundant, 𝐓𝐌𝐏𝐿 has yielded little more than bones. The Kalinga rhinoceros site shows that stone tools were present on Luzon hundreds of thousands of years earlier, so tool-making ability was almost certainly part of the picture. But whether the Luzon people carried on that tradition and what form it took remains unknown. In some ways, this lack of evidence deepens the mystery. We can reconstruct their anatomy, we can speculate about their isolation, but the texture of their daily lives is hidden from us. Still, we can piece together a likely ecological world. Luzon in the late Pleistocene was home to pygmy elephants, giant rats, and large reptiles. These island ecosystems, shaped by isolation, tend to produce strange assemblages of species. For small-bodied humans, survival would have meant adapting to available prey, gathering fruits and tubers, and avoiding predators like crocodiles. In such a setting, climbing skills and agility would have been useful, and the curved finger bones of Homo luzonensis may reflect exactly that kind of adaptation. What makes this story especially haunting is the timing. The remains date to between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. That places them squarely in the same age as Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and the earliest expansions of Homo sapiens beyond Africa. Once again, the picture of the past fills with diversity. Our species was not alone. The world was a patchwork of human forms, each clinging to their own ecological stage. On Luzon, one of those forms was small, island-bound, and almost invisible to history until a few bones in a cave gave them back their name. The name itself, Homo luzonensis, is a reminder that these beings are not abstractions. They lived on a real island, in real forests, under the same stars as us. Yet their entire known existence can be held in a shoebox of fossils. From so little, we try to imagine their world. It is humbling, because it shows how fragile our knowledge is. One excavation pit can add a whole new branch to the human tree. One overlooked bone can redraw migration maps that seemed settled. It also forces us to think differently about human capacity. If populations of archaic humans were crossing seas hundreds of thousands of years ago, perhaps we have underestimated their abilities. Maybe they had a kind of proto-seafaring, not in the sense of charts and sails, but in the sense of curiosity, persistence, and willingness to take risks. After all, islands like Luzon are visible from distant shores on clear days. The temptation to find out what lay beyond the horizon may not be uniquely modern. The haunting question is why they disappeared. By 50,000 years ago, the bones vanish. Did climate shifts change their habitat? Did volcanic eruptions devastate the island? Or did modern humans, arriving in waves across Southeast Asia, outcompete them? The answers remain elusive, but the pattern is familiar. Many human lineages endured in isolation until the arrival of Homo sapiens, after which their traces quickly fade. Luzon may have been no exception. And so the story of Homo luzonensis becomes part of a larger theme. Humans were not a single march of progress, but a multitude of experiments. Some lived on wide open steppes, some in icy caves, some in high plateaus, and some on islands surrounded by blue seas. Luzon's people remind us that even the most remote places were touched by human presence long before history began. If you stood on a Philippine shore 70,000 years ago and looked inland, you might have seen small figures moving in the forest, gathering, hunting, surviving in ways both familiar and strange. Would you have recognized them as human? They had hands, they walked upright, they left bones in caves. They were human in every way that mattered, and yet they were different enough to force us to widen the very definition of what human means. The island puzzle is not solved. It is only deepened. With every discovery, the sea crossings of the ancient world seem less impossible and more inevitable. Perhaps humans of all kinds have always been drawn to the edges of maps, to the line where land meets water, and beyond. Were Ice Age humans really just meat-eaters? If you ask someone to picture a Neanderthal or an early Homo sapiens, most people imagine a figure trudging across snow, dragging a heavy mammoth leg over one shoulder, or standing before a roaring fire surrounded by bones and hides. It is an image cemented by popular culture, but it may not reflect reality. The more carefully we study the microscopic traces left in teeth, the burnt fragments scattered in caves, and the chemical signals locked inside ancient bones, the more complicated the picture becomes. Humans 100,000 years ago were not eating the same things everywhere. Instead, their diets diverged, shaped by climate, landscape, and culture. Let us begin with Neanderthals. For a long time, the stereotype of Neanderthals as exclusively carnivorous seemed supported by data. Bones from sites in Belgium, dating to around 100,000 years ago, show nitrogen isotope ratios that are remarkably high. These isotopes act as a chemical fingerprint of diet. The higher they are, the more meat was consumed, because carnivores accumulate the isotopic signature of the animals they eat. In the case of the Belgian Neanderthals, the results suggest diets that place them squarely at the top of the food chain, comparable to wolves or lions. This seemed to confirm the idea of Neanderthals as specialist hunters, focused on large herbivores like mammoth, bison and reindeer. But then came discoveries that disrupted the neat story. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 in Spain, Neanderthal teeth revealed different traces. The calculus, the hardened plaque preserved for tens of thousands of years, contained fragments of starch granules, plant fibres, and even chemical compounds associated with medicinal plants like yarrow or chamomile. These Neanderthals were not only eating plants, but perhaps experimenting with them, possibly even using bitter herbs for health. Their nitrogen isotopes were lower too, pointing to a mixed diet. The contrast between Belgium and Spain makes it clear that Neanderthals were not locked into a single way of eating. They adapted to their environments, sometimes leaning heavily on meat in the north, sometimes diversifying with plants in southern forests. This variability reminds us that humans are opportunistic feeders. Early Homo sapiens demonstrate the same pattern. At sites across Africa dating to roughly the same period, we see evidence for what archaeologists call broad-spectrum economies. Instead of relying solely on big game, people gathered a wide range of resources: shellfish, small game, nuts, seeds and roots. One striking case comes from Mozambique, where stone tools show microscopic wear consistent with grinding plant matter. Analysis of residues reveals sorghum, a wild grass still important today as a cereal crop. This is one of the earliest examples of humans processing starchy seeds. Nearly 100,000 years before agriculture, such practices show flexibility. Grinding seeds is labour-intensive compared to spearing a large animal, but it provides a reliable fallback when herds are scarce. It also marks an important cognitive step, knowing how to process tough, fibrous foods into something edible and digestible. That kind of knowledge spreads within communities and becomes part of cultural survival strategies. Other clues about diet come from unlikely sources like tortoise shells. At some Middle Eastern sites, archaeologists have found cracked tortoise shells with burn marks, suggesting they were roasted and eaten. Tortoises are slow and easy to catch, essentially a kind of prehistoric fast food. They provide meat without the risks of hunting large prey, and they can be stored alive until needed. Evidence for this behaviour appears both in Neanderthal and Homo sapiens contexts, indicating that both groups saw the value in small, predictable meals. What emerges from all this is a picture of divergence, but not in the sense of one group eating plants and the other eating meat. Instead, divergence means variation across space and time. In colder northern Europe, Neanderthals may have relied more heavily on meat because plant resources were limited for much of the year. In Mediterranean or forested regions, their diets broadened to include nuts, tubers and herbs. Early Homo sapiens in Africa and the Levant seem to have leaned into variety as a strategy, incorporating aquatic foods, plants, and small animals alongside large game. The question then is whether these dietary differences mattered for survival. Some researchers suggest that the broader diet of Homo sapiens gave them an advantage in times of stress. When climate shifted or herds moved, sapiens could fall back on fish, seeds, or small animals. Neanderthals, if too specialized in some regions, may have been more vulnerable when prey populations declined. But we should be cautious. The evidence shows Neanderthals were capable of dietary flexibility too, as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 demonstrates. It may not be that one species was smarter or more adaptable, but that the environments they occupied pushed them toward different emphases. There is also the question of cooking. Both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens used fire, and cooking dramatically expands what can be eaten. Starches become digestible, toxins are reduced, and flavours are unlocked. Burnt plant remains in hearths, and traces in dental calculus show that both groups knew how to transform raw ingredients into meals. This further complicates the stereotype of raw meat eaters. By 100,000 years ago, cooking was deeply embedded in human life, shaping not just diet but social organisation around hearths. One haunting line of evidence comes from bones themselves. Scrape marks on animal remains tell us about butchery practices. At some sites, bones are cracked open for marrow, an energy-rich food source. At others, there is evidence of boiling bones to extract grease. These methods show that humans, both Neanderthals and sapiens, squeezed every calorie from carcasses. Such behaviour makes sense in Ice Age conditions where food security was never guaranteed. It also shows the ingenuity of humans in making marginal resources edible. The stereotype of humans as only hunters of giant beasts is further weakened by the sheer number of small animal remains at many sites. Birds, rabbits, tortoises, and fish appear in archaeological contexts across Africa, Europe, and Asia. These may not seem glamorous compared to mammoth hunts, but they were dependable. Hunting a reindeer might feed a group for days, but catching rabbits or gathering shellfish provided steady meals with less risk. The story of human diet is one of pragmatism, not heroics, and yet the nitrogen isotopes from Belgium remain. They remind us that in some contexts Neanderthals really did function as apex carnivores. This raises another intriguing question. How did their bodies handle such high levels of protein? Modern humans eating too much lean meat risk protein poisoning, sometimes called rabbit starvation. To avoid this, fat and carbohydrates are needed. Perhaps Neanderthals balanced their diets with marrow and fat from large herbivores, or with seasonal plants when available. It is a puzzle still unresolved, but it underscores that their survival required careful ecological knowledge. Meanwhile, the early experiments in plant processing by Homo sapiens hint at something that would later transform the world. Grinding sorghum in Mozambique around 100,000 years ago is not agriculture, but it foreshadows the cognitive link between food and technology. Once humans learned to unlock the calories of tough seeds with grinding stones, a pathway opened toward farming tens of millennia later. It shows that the seeds of agriculture were being tested long before they sprouted into fields. When we step back, the picture of human diet 100,000 years ago is not one of monotony, but of divergence and experimentation. Different groups across different regions developed distinct solutions to the eternal question of what to eat. Some relied on large prey, some diversified with plants and small animals, and some invented entirely new ways of processing foods. These differences were not static. As climates shifted and populations moved, diets shifted too. The human story is one of constant adaptation, and food is at the heart of that story. So were Ice Age humans just meat eaters? The answer is no, or at least not always. They were hunters, yes, but also gatherers, processors, experimenters, and opportunists. They ate what they could, what they knew, and what their landscapes offered. The haunting question is how much we are still shaped by those ancient diets. Do our modern cravings for meat, fat, or starch echo the survival strategies of people in caves 100,000 years ago? Or have we long since broken away from those ancestral patterns, inventing cuisines that bear little resemblance to the pragmatic meals of our forebears? We will never taste the exact flavours of that time, but the bones, the seeds, and the shells tell us enough to know that human diets then were as diverse as human cultures now. Survival was never about eating just one thing. It was about finding many ways to eat and passing that knowledge along. How advanced was technology when the world was still stone? It is easy to imagine the Stone Age as a time of crude flakes and rough tools, with our ancestors just barely managing to chip edges sharp enough to butcher meat. Yet the evidence from 100,000 years ago challenges this picture. By then, humans were not only breaking stone but engineering it, combining materials, harnessing fire, and producing composite tools that required planning and skill. In many ways, the world of technology was already far beyond simple rocks struck against rocks. One of the clearest signs of this sophistication comes from the Levallois technique. At first glance, Levallois flakes might just look like any other stone tools, but their creation reveals a leap in abstract thinking. Instead of striking randomly, toolmakers carefully prepared cores, shaping a block of stone in a deliberate sequence so that when struck, it would yield a flake of predetermined size and shape. This was not improvisation, but design. It required visualizing the final product, understanding how force would travel through stone, and preparing a plan in advance. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀 tools appear across Africa, Europe and Asia during this period, suggesting that both Homo sapiens and Neanderthal shared this technological innovation. But stone alone was not enough. To make a tool truly effective, it often had to be attached to something else. A sharp flake could cut, but mounted on a wooden shaft it became a spear. This is where resin comes into the story. At sites in Africa and Europe, archaeologists have discovered traces of natural adhesives used for hafting stone points onto handles. In some cases, this adhesive was a mixture of plant resin, such as from conifers, combined with ochre to strengthen and stabilize it. The process was far from simple. Resin had to be collected, often by heating or tapping trees, and then processed to achieve the right consistency. Too brittle, and the point would snap off. Too sticky, and it would not hold under stress. To master this required experimentation and the ability to remember and teach successful recipes. The use of fire to transform materials extended beyond adhesives. One of the most striking examples comes from southern Africa, where early Homo sapiens discovered that certain stones, like silkrete, could be heat-treated to improve their flaking qualities. At sites such as Pinnacle Point, pieces of silkrete were deliberately placed in hearths, where controlled heating altered their structure at the microscopic level. After heating, the stone fractured more predictably, and could be shaped into sharper, more durable blades. This practice, dating back nearly 100,000 years, represents one of the earliest known cases of humans deliberately using fire as a technology to alter raw materials. It was not accidental. It required knowledge of how long and how hot to heat the stone without destroying it. In effect, it was an early form of material science. Alongside stone and resin, bone also entered the technological repertoire. In Morocco, archaeologists have found bone knives dating to around 90,000 years ago. These tools show deliberate shaping and polishing, with edges designed for cutting tasks. Bone as a raw material requires different skills than stone. It is less predictable in fracture but can be worked into finer points and smoother edges. The choice to use bone reflects flexibility and creativity. It also shows that humans were not limited to a single raw material, but drew on whatever resources were available, adapting techniques accordingly. When we put these pieces together, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 technique, resin hafting, heat-treated stone and bone knives, we see a technological world that is far richer than the old stereotype of cavemen with crude clubs. These were people who understood materials, who planned sequences of actions in advance, and who combined different components to produce more effective tools. Such behaviour suggests a capacity for abstract thought, experimentation, and teaching. After all, none of these techniques are obvious at first glance. Someone had to invent them, test them, and pass them on. The presence of adhesives is particularly telling. Hafting transforms the way a tool works, increasing force and precision. But it also transforms the way humans interact with tools. A composite tool has multiple parts, each requiring its own preparation. Wood must be cut and shaped, stone knapped, resin collected and processed, and sometimes bindings added from sinew or fibre. This means that tool-making becomes a social process, with different tasks potentially carried out by different members of a group. It also means that knowledge must be stored not just in individuals but in communities, carried through tradition and teaching. Some researchers argue that these innovations hint at cognitive complexity on par with our own. To visualize a flake before it exists, to mix adhesives with the right proportions, to heat stone to just the right temperature without shattering it. All of these require planning depth, working memory and communication. They show that by 100,000 years ago, humans had already crossed a threshold. We were no longer just reacting to the environment. We were actively transforming it with knowledge and intention. Yet we should be cautious in drawing straight lines from these technologies to modern engineering. The scale was different, the context specific. Heat-treating silkrete was not metallurgy, but it foreshadowed the logic that would later allow humans to smelt ores and forge metals. Resin hafting was not industrial chemistry, but it carried the same principle of combining substances to create new functions. Bone knives were not factory-made cutlery, but they showed an ability to see potential in the natural world and shape it to human ends. What we can say with confidence is that by 100,000 years ago, humans were already innovating in ways that echo through history. The archaeological record, though fragmentary, gives us glimpses of these skills. A lump of blackened resin with fingerprints impressed into it. A silkrete flake with a glossy surface, betraying the heat that once coursed through it. A bone carefully polished to a knife edge. Each of these artifacts speaks to actions long past, to people who sat around fires testing, shaping, and perfecting their tools. These were moments of learning, of frustration when resin cracked or stone shattered, and of satisfaction when a spear point held firm or a blade sliced cleanly. What we do not know is how these technologies were shared. Did knowledge spread slowly, passed from one group to the next through encounters and migrations? Or were these techniques reinvented independently in different regions, each group solving similar problems with similar insights? The distribution of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 were wide sharing or parallel invention, but hafting and heat treatment may have been more localized. The answer matters, because it tells us whether human populations of the time were connected by networks of knowledge or isolated innovators scattered across continents. There is also the haunting question of how many other innovations have been lost to time. Resin and wood decay quickly. Fire leaves only faint traces. For every preserved hafted tool, how many vanished without a trace? For every heat-treated flake, how many crumbled away? The archaeological record is biased towards stone, but the technological world of 100,000 years ago surely included perishable tools, wooden spears, fibre cords, leather bindings, that are now invisible. This means that what we see may only be a fraction of what humans were capable of. So how advanced was technology when the world was still stone? More advanced than we once believed, but still deeply human in scale. It was not about factories or machines, but about firelit experiments, small groups tinkering with the resources at hand. It was about seeing possibility in stone, bone, and resin, and turning those possibilities into survival. It was about the first sparks of engineering, not yet industrial, but already ingenious. The haunting question we're left with is how many thresholds we crossed without knowing it. When someone in southern Africa first realized that heat could transform stone, did they sense the weight of that discovery? Or was it just another small adjustment, another trick for making better blades, quickly absorbed into daily life and forgotten as innovation turned into tradition? The deep truth is that technology often grows not through sudden revolutions, but through countless small refinements, each one building quietly on the last. 100,000 years ago, humans were already living in that rhythm of discovery and tradition, and in many ways, we still are. What happened when Neanderthals and sapiens met face to face? It is one of the most haunting questions in human history, because these meetings were not imagined. They left bones, stone tools, and hearths layered in the same soils. Between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago, the Levant, that narrow strip of land bridging Africa and Eurasia, became the stage for encounters between two species of humans. Neither side was a shadow or a stranger. Both were toolmakers, hunters, fire users. Both could read the landscape, plan a hunt, and comfort their young. The Levant was not just a place on the map. It was the seam where continents touched, where humans who had walked out of Africa found themselves face to face with their cousins who had long ruled Eurasia. The evidence for these crossings comes from caves like Skul and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 in present-day Israel, where burials of early Homo sapiens date to around 100,000 years ago. Just north and west, in places like Kibara and Amud, Neanderthal skeletons appear in layers that overlap in time. This was not a case of one species replacing the other in a single sweep. Instead, it seems that for tens of thousands of years, populations of Neanderthals and sapiens alternated in occupying the same valleys, sometimes coexisting in nearby sites, other times separated by ecological shifts that favoured one or the other. The Levant at that time was not a fixed backdrop, but a shifting climate border. During warmer and wetter phases, the region looked more like a savanna woodland, with animals such as gazelle and fallow deer ranging widely. In colder and drier phases, steppe-like environments pushed southward, bringing species such as aurochs and equids. These swings in climate determined not only the animals available, but also the plants and water sources. For humans, it meant that the land sometimes looked familiar to African-born sapiens, and at other times favoured the cold-adapted hunting strategies of Neanderthals. The archaeological record shows remarkable similarities in technology. Both groups made 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 points. Both used fire. Both processed animal carcasses with efficiency. At sites such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, stratigraphic layers contain tools that could have been made by either group. This makes it difficult for archaeologists to pin down who was present at any given time. But perhaps that is the point. The two were not separated by an unbridgeable gulf of ability. They were matched in many respects, which may be why their encounters were complex. What would it have meant for a group of sapiens moving northward from Africa to suddenly see another kind of human? The Neanderthals of the Levant were robust, with broad bodies and stocky builds suited to retaining heat in cooler climates. To African sapiens, they must have seemed familiar yet strange. Faces with heavy brow ridges, eyes deep set, jaws projecting slightly forward. But they walked upright, carried tools, and tended fires. The recognition of sameness must have been immediate, even if differences stood out. Competition seems inevitable. The animals hunted by both species overlapped: gazelle, deer, wild cattle. Archaeological sites show similar patterns of butchery, marrow extraction, and fire use. In an environment that could only support limited populations, one group's success in hunting may have meant another's scarcity. The Levant, narrow and bounded, was not a limitless plain, but a bottleneck where resources could run thin. This ecological pressure would have heightened the stakes of coexistence. Yet the record also suggests that the two species sometimes occupied the region in alternating waves, perhaps tracking climate shifts. When wetter periods made the land resemble African grasslands, sapiens populations thrived. When colder, drier conditions prevailed, Neanderthals, already adapted to such climates in Europe and Western Asia, may have moved in. These shifts hint that the Levant was not just a crossroads of populations, but also a pendulum of replacement, where climate dictated which human species held the ground. The question of contact goes deeper. Did these groups only compete, or did they sometimes interact in ways more intimate? A fragment of bone, a tooth, cannot tell us about a conversation or a glance, but the close overlap in time and place makes interaction nearly certain. Some scholars point to hybrid-looking fossils, though interpretations remain debated. The suggestion is that at least occasionally, sapiens and Neanderthals may have formed bonds that went beyond competition. If so, the Levant was not only a battleground, but also a zone of entanglement. Still, the archaeological evidence is thin on human interactions themselves. We see hearths, tools, burials. We can infer hunting strategies from cut marks on bones. Neanderthals at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 appear to have hunted large ungulates with coordinated tactics, driving them into difficult terrain. Sapiens at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 show a broader spectrum of prey, including smaller animals and possibly more flexible foraging. This contrast suggests different approaches to survival. It may have meant that in some contexts the two species could occupy overlapping landscapes without direct conflict by exploiting slightly different niches. But in leaner times, overlap would have meant competition. The burial evidence adds a more human dimension. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒, a child burial dated to roughly 100,000 years ago suggests care and ritual. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒, a Neanderthal infant was buried as well. The almost contemporaneous presence of intentional burials by both groups in the same region hints at shared behaviours of meaning and grief. It complicates any attempt to draw a sharp cultural line between them. If they both mourned their dead, how different could they have seemed to one another? What makes this period haunting is how unresolved it feels. Neither group permanently displaced the other in the Levant during this window. Instead, they moved in and out as climate and fortune dictated. Sapiens eventually retreated back to Africa after their early forays, while Neanderthals remained the dominant population in Western Asia and Europe for tens of thousands of years longer. The encounters of 100 to 90,000 years ago were not the final story, but they foreshadowed a future where contact would become more decisive. There is something profoundly human in imagining those first meetings. A hunting party cresting a ridge and spotting figures by a fire who looked almost like them, yet not quite. The hesitation. Were these friends, rivals, or something altogether new? Perhaps there were standoffs, perhaps there were exchanges, perhaps curiosity sometimes won over fear. We do not know. All we have are the layers of caves and the bones of animals they ate. What the record shows is that by this time multiple kinds of humans were thriving, overlapping, and testing the boundaries of coexistence. The world was not yet ours alone. The Levant was the doorway where we stepped into another species' home range, and they into ours. The haunting question remains, when we looked into their eyes, what did we see? Did we see ourselves reflected back, or did we see rivals to be driven away? The truth is likely both. The Levant between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago was not a place of simple answers, but of clashes and crossroads, where two species of human lived close enough to matter to each other, and where the story of our shared humanity began to take on its most complicated shape. What human lineages disappeared before the story even began? When we tell the tale of the late Pleistocene, our attention is usually fixed on the main actors, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and eventually ourselves. But beneath that familiar stage there were other presences, other kinds of humans who emerged, endured for a time, and then slipped away. Their bones are rare, their DNA sometimes just a whisper, their names often provisional. They remind us that the human family was not a narrow line but a tangled web, full of experiments in survival that did not endure. By the time the world settled into the rhythm we now remember, some of those lineages had already vanished. Archaeology and genetics together have begun to reveal these shadows. For decades the story seemed simpler. Neanderthals in the west, Homo erectus lingering in the east, and modern-looking humans in Africa. But new finds have disrupted that neat geography. A jawbone here, a skull fragment there, a set of teeth with unusual shapes, and suddenly the record looks less like three parallel lines and more like a mosaic with missing tiles. These discoveries do not always fit into tidy categories, and often the temptation is to give them new names. But in truth, what they show us is not so much a parade of separate species as a cloud of overlapping populations, each shaped by its environment, each bearing marks of ancient ancestry, and each vulnerable to disappearance. Take the example of the Nesher Ramla hominins of the Levant. In 2021, researchers described fossils found at a site in central Israel, dating to roughly 120,000 to 140,000 years ago. The remains consisted of a partial skull and jaw that did not match neatly with known Neanderthal or sapiens features. Instead, they displayed a mixture. Some traits robust and archaic, others pointing toward Neanderthals, but not fully so. Alongside these bones lay stone tools remarkably similar to those used by other humans in the region, suggesting technological overlap. Were these Nesher Ramla people a distinct lineage? Were they a regional population connected to Neanderthals, perhaps a sister group that split earlier? Or were they remnants of an even deeper archaic population, lingering in the Levant while newer forms arrived? Whatever they were, they seemed to represent a human group that lived and thrived in the Middle East, yet vanished without leaving a clear successor. Nesher Ramla is not the only puzzle. In China, several fossil finds dating to between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago also resist easy classification. The skull from Dali, found in the 1970s and dated to around 209,000 years ago, combines a large brain size with thick cranial bones and robust brow ridges. The Harbin skull, sometimes nicknamed Dragon Man, is another example. Massive, archaic-looking, yet with brain volume approaching the modern range. These fossils suggest populations that were neither classic Homo erectus nor clearly Denisovan, though genetic evidence hints they may have been related to the Denisovan lineage. For now, we cannot say with certainty who they were. What we can say is that they lived, hunted, and died across East Asia for tens of thousands of years, and then left little but bones too strange to classify. This pattern repeats across the Old World. In southern Africa, fossils like those at Florisbad, dating to around 260,000 years ago, show a mix of archaic and modern traits. In Europe, specimens such as the Cima de los Huesos hominins from Spain, dating to over 400,000 years ago, appear to be ancestors of Neanderthals, but also carry unexpected genetic signals that link to Denisovans. These populations tell us that lineages split and rejoined, that hybrids were not rare, and that extinction often followed soon after. Genetics has added another layer of strangeness. When scientists sequence the DNA of Neanderthals and Denisovans, they sometimes find traces of ancestry that cannot be explained by known groups. These so-called ghost populations left no clear fossils we can point to, yet their genetic fingerprints survive inside the genomes of other archaic humans. It is as if there were entire peoples we have never seen, who interbred with Neanderthals or Denisovans, and then vanished completely. We cannot give them names, we cannot reconstruct their faces, but we know they existed. They stand as the ultimate reminder of how incomplete the fossil record is, and how many human kinds have been lost to time. The Middle Pleistocene, the period between roughly 800,000 and 120,000 years ago, was especially rich in these experiments. Populations were spread thin across continents, often isolated by deserts, mountains, or climate swings. When conditions allowed, they expanded and sometimes met. When conditions worsened, they dwindled. The result was a dynamic patchwork of humans, some robust and long-lived, others fragile and fleeting. The ones we remember, Neanderthals, Denisovans, sapiens, are only the survivors. The others were already gone by the time our story took its most familiar shape. What would these vanished humans have been like in life? Their bones suggest strong bodies, capable hunters, skilled at making tools. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 hominins used Levallois technology, striking cores with precision to produce sharp flakes. The Dali skull and Harbin fossil suggest big brains, though brain size alone tells us little about behaviour. At Florisbad, stone tools and animal remains point to organised hunting and butchery. These were not primitive creatures wandering without skill. They were humans by any fair measure, part of the same unfolding experiment of survival that produced us. Their disappearance raises unsettling questions. Did they vanish because they were replaced by better adapted groups, or did they simply merge into other populations until their distinctiveness faded? Was extinction sudden, driven by climate collapse or competition, or was it gradual, a long decline into obscurity? We may never know. What we do know is that the record of humanity is not one of steady progress, but of branching and pruning, where many branches ended before they could become thick trunks. When we look back at 300,000 to 100,000 years ago, what stands out is the sheer variety of humans alive at once. Erectus lingered in Indonesia, Neanderthals dominated Europe, Denisovans roamed Asia, sapiens were spreading through Africa, and then there were these other groups, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿, Dali, Harbin, Florisbad. It was a world crowded not just with animals, but with humans of many kinds. Some we can name, others we can only glimpse, and still others we know only as shadows in DNA. The haunting reality is that most of them are gone. Their faces will never be reconstructed with certainty. Their languages, if they had them, are silent, their cultures erased. What we have instead are fragments of bone and stone, which whisper that they were here. When we find them, we are reminded that the story of humanity was never inevitable. Survival was a matter of chance as much as adaptation. For every lineage that lasted, others disappeared before anyone could tell their tale. So when we ask what lineages disappeared before the story even began, the answer is many. More than we can name, more than we will ever know. They were humans who walked the earth, hunted, raised children, and watched the same stars, but whose names and stories are lost. They remind us that our species is not the whole of humanity, just the last surviving thread in a tapestry woven with countless others. The haunting question lingers. How many human faces have been erased by time, and how much of ourselves do we still carry from the ones already gone? If you stood there 100,000 years ago, would you know who survives? The world at that moment was filled with humans of many kinds. You would not have had to search hard to find them. From the forests of Europe to the mountains of Central Asia, from the caves of the Levant to the islands of Southeast Asia, from the savannas of Africa to the rivers of Siberia, there were humans everywhere. Some were short, some tall, some broad, some delicate. Their faces were not all the same, their skulls told different stories, and their tools reflected their local traditions. Yet they were all recognisably human. If you had walked among them, you would have seen Neanderthals, thick-browed, powerful, and at home in cold landscapes. You might have met Denisovans, still elusive to us now, but then fully present, hunting across the vastness of Asia. On an island in what we now call Indonesia, small-bodied Homo floresiensis, 3 feet tall, were making their way through forests with stone tools in hand. On another island to the north, in Luzon, another small-bodied species existed, with its own ancient heritage. In Africa, populations of early Homo sapiens were moving between grasslands and rivers, gathering plants, hunting, experimenting with fire and stone. And far to the east, the last communities of Homo erectus still held on, stubbornly enduring on the island of Java. 6 kinds of humans, 1 planet. No clear sign of who would last. It is easy, looking back from today, to imagine inevitability, to see our own species as the destined survivor. But if you had been alive then, you would not have known which lineage would carry the story forward. Neanderthals had the advantage of being well adapted to cold environments. Denisovans seemed vast in range, stretching from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau. The tiny humans of Flores had endured isolation for millennia, proving resilience in their own way. Erectus had already survived for over 1 million years, far longer than we have so far, showing a persistence unmatched in human history. Against them, our own species was young, only a few 100,000 years old, still limited mostly to Africa and small forays beyond. Nothing about the situation made the future obvious, and yet, within a span of less than 100,000 years, all of those other lineages would vanish. The Neanderthals gone, the Denisovans reduced to genetic echoes, floresiensis and luzonensis leaving behind only bones in caves. Erectus finally extinguished. By the time the Ice Age reached its most brutal swings, only 1 lineage of humans would remain: United States. What explains that? Climate certainly played a role. The period between 120,000 and 80,000 years ago was a time of instability. Shifts between warm and cold, expansions of deserts, contractions of forests, rising and falling seas, all of these created pressures that no group could escape. Populations were pushed into refuges, then scattered when the climate opened again. These changes fractured communities, forced migrations, and sometimes left entire regions depopulated. It is possible that some lineages, isolated too long in fragile environments, simply ran out of room to survive. Competition also must have mattered. Where ranges overlapped, humans met humans. In the Levant, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared the same caves at different times. On the steppes of Central Asia, Denisovans and Neanderthals likely encountered one another, and perhaps us as well. These meetings were not always violent. They could lead to exchange, interbreeding, or parallel existence. But they also meant competition for prey, for firewood, for shelter. 2 groups in the same landscape may have been one too many. Still, when we speak of what was lost, we cannot reduce it to climate and competition alone. Each of these humans carried within them ways of being that are now forever erased. Neanderthals, for instance, clearly had a culture of their own. They buried some of their dead, used pigments, and may have spoken. Denisovans, though almost invisible to us, passed on genetic adaptations to high altitudes that survive in living people today. Floresiensis, with their small brains and small bodies, challenge our assumptions about what is necessary to endure. Erectus remind us that simplicity of technology is not always a weakness, and that sheer persistence can rival innovation. Luzonensis shows that even remote islands, once thought unreachable without boats, could be reached by humans long before our histories began. If you stood there 100,000 years ago, you would not only have seen a crowded world of human faces, you would also have seen a crowded world of human possibilities. 6 lineages meant 6 experiments in what it meant to live. 6 strategies for turning stone, bone, and fire into survival. 6 ways of fitting into the landscapes of the Ice Age. It is humbling to realise that most of those possibilities were cut off before they could unfold further. And so the haunting question, what remains of them in us? Some of the answer is genetic. A few traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry persist in living humans. These are faint echoes, but they prove that encounters between lineages left lasting marks. Some of the answer is ecological. We inherited landscapes that others had already shaped with fire and tools. Some of the answer may be cultural, though this is harder to see. Perhaps techniques, habits, or even ways of seeing the world were passed from one group to another, then carried forward unknowingly by us. But much of what they were is gone. We do not know the sounds their languages made. We do not know the stories they told, or if they sang, or what they feared. We don't know how they thought about death, though their burials suggest they felt its weight. We do not know how they greeted the sun, or prepared for the hunt. Those absences are permanent. To stand at 100,000 years ago is to stand at a crossroads, but also in a fog. The last question before us is not only who will survive, but what kind of humanity will survive. Will it be the strong, cold-adapted Neanderthals, the resilient Denisovans, the island dwarfs, the enduring Erectus, or us, the newcomers still mostly confined to Africa? History, as we know it, answered in our favour. But history as it was lived then gave no such assurance. To the people alive in that time, survival was simply the work of each day, and no one could know which lineage would carry forward. What remains most haunting is the silence. 100,000 years ago, 6 kinds of humans filled the world. Now only one remains. We live surrounded by their absence, inheritors not only of their successes, but also of their disappearances. Every time we look at their fossils, we confront the truth that humanity was once plural, and now is singular. So the question we are left with is not only who survived, but what was lost when the others did not. And perhaps the deeper question is this: if the world was filled once with many kinds of humans, what does it mean that only one is left? Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.